Chapter 1, Eddard I. Chapter text. I served in Aes King's Guard for 10 years. I wanted to kill him hundreds of times. I had hundreds of chances to do it. But I never did. For every time I failed to act, the gods will curse me 100 times over. And I deserve it. Oswell went. My lord, we have arrived at King's Landing, reported Mark Riswell. What is the state of the city? Ned asked. All gates are tightly shut, a chain has been drawn across the harbor, and entry and exit are completely forbidden. The city walls are filled with soldiers. Without a doubt, they are preparing for a long siege. Ned let out a deep sigh and dismounted his horse. Understood. We will rest today. Tomorrow, we will begin constructing the siege camp and building the siege equipment. Send word to Robert about the situation. He must come here immediately and join the siege. I just hope Mace Tyrell doesn't do something foolish like supporting the Targaryens, or this war will drag on much longer. The lords and soldiers around him immediately gave their approval and began preparing the camp. As the commander of the army, Ned's tent was naturally the first to be set up. His tent was large and comfortable, easy to erect and dismantle, and made of fine fabric brought from Myr. In certain places, the three-headed dragon sigil of House Targaryen could still be seen. Of course, the tent did not originally belong to Ned. It had once been the property of Prince Rhaegar, who had been slain by Robert at the Battle of the Trident. After the battle, Ned had taken the tent as spoils of war. He planned to eventually replace the dragon sigils with the direwolf of House Stark. He stepped inside comfortably and sat at the table. Spreading out his maps, he took small sips from his ale as he began strategizing for the siege. Though the rebel army had won the Battle of the Trident, the victory had come at a heavy cost. The Stormlands army was nearly shattered, while the Vale's armored cavalry had lost almost half its numbers. The strongest forces remaining were the Northmen and the Riverlanders under Ned's command, which was why he had led his army ahead of the others to lay siege to King's Landing as soon as possible. The rest of their allies would join later. He studied the map of Westeros, trying to predict how the other kingdoms would react to recent events. Dorne would likely continue supporting the Targaryens, as their priority was ensuring the safety of Elia Martell and her children. However, considering the heavy losses their army had suffered at the Trident, their aid would not be particularly significant. The real concern was the Tyrells. They still commanded an army of 60,000, while the rebels could muster only half that number. Prince Rhaegar dead, if the Tyrells chose to continue supporting the Targaryens, they would be fighting to uphold the rule of a mad king. Many Reach Lords would be reluctant to do so. In fact, if they searched hard enough, they might even find some traitors willing to aid the rebels. And what of the Westerlands? What would the new Lord Paramount of the West, Jaime Lannister, do? Ned was uncertain, but it seemed unlikely that he would support the Targaryens. Everything had changed just a week before the tourney of Harrenhal. The previous Lord Paramount of the Westerlands and former Hand of the King, Lord Tywin Lannister, had been inspecting the port of Lannisport when a terrible accident occurred. A ship's mast had collapsed on top of him. It was said that his head had burst like a melon, and only his bones had been recovered. While all of Westeros was shocked by this news, King Aes the Mad was overjoyed. He had invited Jaime Lannister to the Harrenhal tournament and, in front of the people, declared him the new Lord Paramount of the Westerlands. During the ceremony, he did not hold back from recounting how Tywin Lannister had died in such a pitiful manner. Ned was watching the ceremony from a distance but had personally seen how Jaime Lannister's face turned red with anger, and how he bit his lips so hard that they bled to stop himself from speaking. After the ceremony, the new Lord Lannister immediately left the tournament with all the Westerland nobles. When the rebellion started, Robert and Ned had hoped that the Lannisters, insulted by the Targaryens, would join the rebellion, but Lord Jaime, most likely encouraged by his uncle Kevan, decided to remain neutral. He responded to calls for support from both sides with complete silence. Meanwhile, he had gathered a 12,000 strong Westerland cavalry army at Golden Tooth. Some rebel lords feared that the Lannisters would strike them in the back, but Ned personally didn't believe in this possibility. After being publicly humiliated at the Harrenhal tournament, if the Lannisters had continued to support the Targaryens, they would have been treated like dishonorable nobles. Jaime Lannister had sympathy for Prince Rhaegar and had been knighted by Arthur Dayne. However, there was no reason for him to remain loyal to the Targaryens. Even if Jaime wanted to support the Targaryens, his uncles wouldn't have allowed it. After the Battle of Trident, another envoy was sent to Lord Lannister. Various privileges were offered to the Westerlands in exchange for joining the rebellion, and Benjen's hand was offered to Lady Cersei. It was unlikely the marriage proposal would be accepted, but among the Lord Paramount families, there were no other suitable bachelors. Ned hoped that Jaime Lannister would join the rebels this time, which would mean that 5 of the 7 kingdoms would raise their banners against the Targaryens. This would seriously make the Tyrells hesitate in maintaining their loyalty. After a while, one of Ned's deputy commanders and mentors in the war, Brynden Tully, entered. The two of them began discussing siege strategies. For now, the Mudgate seemed to be the most suitable target, and they would have to build as many siege towers as possible before the Allied forces arrived. The Reach army remained a threat, and Ned had to stay prepared for a possible attack from behind. The two debated throughout the night and finally decided how the preparations should be made. Ned, exhausted, took off his armor and, as soon as he laid his head on the pillow, fell asleep. Even though it only lasted 5 minutes, he enjoyed the peace of his sleep. Ned. Ned. He realized someone was trying to shake him awake forcefully. As Ned got out of bed, he muttered a curse to himself. Howland, I just fell asleep, he said to his friend, sighing. I hope this is really important news. Come outside, you need to see this, Howland said, practically dragging Ned by the arm. It's urgent. Ned didn't say much. He calmly got out of bed, drank a glass of cold water to calm himself, and began to follow his friend, Howland Reed. He stepped out of the tent and, upon seeing the view of the city, his mouth dropped open in shock. The city gates appeared to be wide open, and all the torches at the gates were still burning, clearly indicating the gates were open. Ned was watching from a distance, but there appeared to be no guards. Other Northern and Riverrun lords started emerging from their tents as well. They saw the same sight as Ned and reacted with the same astonishment. All the city gates are open, and there are no guards, Howland Reed reported. The lords and soldiers in the area began to discuss this unexpected situation in confusion. However, most of the responses were positive. The Golden Cloaks must have betrayed Aerys, John Bracken suggested. They didn't want to serve a mad king. Quite normal. I agree, said Titus Blackwood. We should enter the city while we have the chance. If we execute Aerys, this war will end immediately. Ned noticed in shock that Blackwood and Bracken were agreeing on something. Is a meteor about to fall? If the Golden Cloaks have betrayed Aerys, they should have sent an envoy to inform us of the city's surrender, said Roose Bolton. This situation is not as simple as it seems. We should approach with caution. The lords began to argue animatedly. The majority demanded that the entire army gather and assault the city, while a smaller minority argued that this could be a trap. The discussion between the two sides grew more heated, and voices rose. Enough. Ned slammed his fist on the table. I've made my decision. Uncle Andrew. He turned to the elderly man beside him. Ned's great-uncle, Andrew Locke, was the brother of his grandmother Marna Locke and had been the lord of Oldcastle for a long time. Though old and not as athletic as the younger men, he was the most experienced commander in the army. Take 2,000 men and enter King's Landing. Once inside the city, I want you to head straight for the Red Keep without wasting time. Elia Martell and the children are to be taken to safety, and not a hair on their heads is to be harmed. As for Aerys, Ned gritted his teeth. I want that dragon monstrosity in front of me, and I will personally execute him. After taking the keep and ensuring everything is secure, send a messenger to us. Andrew Locke, one of the lords who had advocated for a cautious approach to the city's invasion, did not object to Ned's orders and immediately approved them. He began issuing orders to the soldiers to prepare for the mission. Ned hoped everything would proceed smoothly while his great-uncle entered the city with 2,000 men. He felt guilty for sending him into a potential trap, but he trusted Lord Andrew. This was the move that had to be made. An hour passed. During that time, Ned had the army ready for action. He issued strict orders to avoid pillaging the city and to not harm the civilians. As he prepared the army for an assault position, he waited for the messenger. Before long, a group of soldiers entered the camp. Ned recognized the lock seal on their uniforms and ordered that the messenger be brought immediately. The orders were carried out exactly, my lord, the messenger reported. We encountered very little resistance entering the city. The Golden Cloaks surrendered immediately and laid down their arms. Elia Martell and the children are secured in rooms within the Red Keep. King Aes was being protected by Drold Hightower, and we had to kill him. The king, now chained, is waiting for your judgment in the throne room. He has completely lost his mind, screaming burn them all. Very well, Ned said. I suppose our concerns were unfounded. No honorable man would want to serve a mad king. He continued, tell the army to immediately. At that moment, a huge thunderous noise shook the ground. As the earth trembled, many lords, including Ned, fell from their chairs. What the hell is happening? Shouted Roderick Riswell, struggling to lift the table that had fallen on top of him. Ned quickly got to his feet. Another thunderous noise followed, and the ground shook again, but this time, Ned was ready and didn't fall. Get out of the tent, you fools! Brynden Tully yelled, lifting the table off Roderick Riswell. The tent's going to collapse on us. Ned immediately grabbed his sword, Ice, from the corner and ran toward the entrance of the tent. Just then, the ground trembled once more. He passed Lord Piper, who was kneeling and praying for mercy, and exited the tent to witness a scene he would never forget for the rest of his life. King's Landing had almost turned into a ghost town. A green mist covered the city, settling over everything like a deadly shroud. Wildfire spread through the city, slowly consuming everything in its path. Flames engulfed the area within seconds, but the green smoke that followed felt like the silence after the fire, a foreboding sense of impending doom. As the wildfire concentrated on the city, people screamed, struggling to escape, but no matter how far they ran, the green fire relentlessly pursued them. The eyes of those watching the fall of Baelor's September seemed to lose focus for a moment under the green light. The magnificent dome and majestic walls were torn apart by the force of the explosion, and the green smoke that enveloped the city seemed to drift through the air like a dying scream. It began to slowly swallow everything alive, erasing every life, every dream. The effect of the wildfire spread like a blanket, signaling the end of an era. As people failed to escape, the air they breathed in their final moments only showed them the truth of their end. King's Landing wasn't just a city, it marked the end of a civilization, and the death of a belief. As Ned was shaken by another explosion, he watched the Lion's Gate completely disappear. At that moment, only one thought passed through his mind. 1 million people. 1 million people lived in this city. 1 million men, women, and children were dying in front of Ned's eyes, burning and screaming. The North's population was about 5 million. Ned was witnessing the death of a fifth of his country's population. For several minutes, he did nothing. He only etched the scene into his memory, a sight he would never forget. Lords and soldiers around him were shouting, some praying to their gods, while others, like Ned, simply stared at the devastation. Ned! Ned! Lord Stark, he felt someone grab his shoulder and shake him violently. Without reacting, he looked at the man who was shaking him with a stoic expression. That green smoke from the city, Howland Reed said, pointing toward the city. That smoke is poisonous, and the wind is blowing toward us. If we stay here much longer, we'll be exposed to the poison. We need to retreat. We must retreat immediately. Upon hearing his friend's warning, Ned immediately sprang to his feet and shouted to the soldiers to pull back as he raced toward his horse. The army's discipline had completely broken down. After witnessing such a scene, it was impossible for them to remain calm. Men were shouting at each other, and in panic, they scattered to random points, fleeing to the opposite side of the city. Ned, galloping away from the city on his horse, was quickly followed by the other lords. After a while, he turned around and checked the situation. The city was now just a faint outline, but it continued to glow like a green star. The city was burning, the screams carried away by the wind, and Ned Stark knew that this was neither the end of a war nor the fall of a king, this was the end of an era. Chapter 2, Hoster I. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. After the incredibly tragic event in which Aes the Wicked, may his soul burn in the deepest corners of the seven hells, blew up King's Landing with wildfire, causing the cataclysm later known as the Greedoom and killing over 1 million people. The rebel leaders convened a great council in Maidenpool to determine the future of Westeros. However, not even they could have foreseen how this council would unfold. From Greedoom and after, the wolves marched to power by Maester Vat. Madness, thought Hoster. What else could explain this? Madness. When news of what had happened in King's Landing first reached him, he had dismissed it as an absurd and grim joke. He had even threatened to execute the servant who delivered the letter. It bore his brother's personal seal, yet Hoster refused to believe it. His brother could have died in battle, his seal stolen, and his enemies might have forged this letter, filled with such utter nonsense, to deceive and unnerve him. His brother's handwriting could have been expertly copied. Or perhaps they had tortured Brynden, shattered his will, and forced him to write these words. The Seven Hells. Hoster was willing to accept any alternative, any explanation, so long as it meant that wretched piece of parchment was lying. 1 million people. He spent hours denying what he read, calling it falsehood. He prayed to the Seven that it was false. Then another letter arrived, bearing the Stark seal and carrying the same message. And Hoster knew, then and there, that his prayers had been in vain. When Jon Arryn read the letter, he did not speak for the entire day. He merely stared at the wall, refusing to eat, to sleep, to move, or even acknowledge those around him. It was as if he had discovered something fascinating within the stone. Robert reacted just as Hoster had, he denied it. He examined the handwriting and the Stark seal 1,000 times over. Then, without a word, he disappeared into some forgotten corner, drinking himself into oblivion. He did not speak to anyone. He sought out no company, no whores. He only drank, staring up at the stars. Eventually, Hoster gathered his courage and rode to see the city with his own eyes. He took the necessary precautions to protect himself from the poisonous fumes before stepping into the ruins. And though he would live many years more, he would never forget what he saw that day. Every night, it returned to him in his nightmares. King's Landing was gone. The flames of wildfire had consumed not just the buildings but the people as well. The bodies lying in the streets were unrecognizable, some had been reduced to ash in an instant, while others had writhed in the fire, their flesh blackened and shriveled beyond all semblance of humanity. Many no longer had faces, their skin had melted away, their eye sockets hollow and empty. Some had been caught mid-flight. One man knelt in a doorway as though in prayer, his body charred solid, his fingers burned down to nothing. A small child remained frozen in its mother's arms, its soot-covered face forever locked in terror. By the river, skeletons lay where they had fallen, their hands reaching desperately for the water. But the black water had not saved them. Even the river had burned. This was no longer a city, it was a wasteland, a graveyard where only death reigned. And though the wildfire's flames had died out, the silent screams of the dead would echo here forever. The Greedoom disaster had not only destroyed King's Landing but also rendered the surrounding area uninhabitable. The poisonous fumes were carried by the wind, drifting wherever it pleased, and literally choking people to death. On the day of the catastrophe, a strong northern wind blew, and the toxic smoke reached as far as Duskendale, causing widespread illness among the people. Immediately after the disaster, all nearby settlements were evacuated. The army's morale had completely collapsed. No one cared about the war anymore. King's Landing had been a massive city of 1 million people, and almost everyone from the southern part of Westeros, whether noble or commoner, had relatives, friends, or acquaintances there. Even if that wasn't the case, no one with any sense could accept the sight of so many innocent people dying miserably in the flames. After denial had passed, it was replaced by anger. At first, the anger was directed at the Targaryens. Any item bearing the three-headed dragon symbol, whether made of gold or clay, was destroyed, regardless of its value. Every trace of the Targaryens in Westeros began to be systematically erased. Anything that represented the dragon was considered blasphemous and was cursed. Southern houses that bore dragons in their crests began changing their banners to avoid becoming targets of the rage. This wasn't just happening in the rebel army, it was occurring all across Westeros. But there was a huge problem. There was no clear target for this vast anger. Aerys was dead. Rhaegar was dead. All that was left was a pitiful, pregnant woman and her child. So how would vengeance be taken? Unable to find a target, the anger spiraled into something far more destructive. The hatred toward the Targaryens was transformed into a deep-seated loathing of the Valyrian people. No silver-haired person in Westeros was safe anymore. According to Hoster, the people of Old Town had stormed the city's most luxurious brothel, where they had brutally slaughtered all the silver-haired prostitutes. Even the nobles weren't safe from this execution. Lord Jordane's second son, who had fought on the Targaryen side in the War of the Trident and had been captured afterward, was a prime target, especially since he had inherited his silver hair from his Lysan mother. Needless to say, he didn't live much longer. The fate of Lord Valerian's daughter was even more horrifying. The poor girl had been under protection in Highgarden during the war, but when the people attacked her, the Tyrell Knights couldn't, or some claimed, didn't, protect her. What happened to her was unknown, but Hoster hoped the poor girl had been granted a quick death. The most shocking news came from Dragonstone. After losing her husband and children in the Greedoom disaster, a servant woman took out her fury on the young Viserys Targaryen. Though Sir Willem Dare intervened and executed the servant on the spot, the poor child had already been stabbed several times. Queen Rulla, unable to mourn the loss of her family, was forced to flee to Essos with a handful of loyal supporters. The Targaryens were no longer safe, even in their ancestral home. Jon and Hoster spent a month sweating through the task of curbing the chaos in their armies, and Robert didn't help at all. He had referred to the dead as dragon seeds and mumbled something about them getting what they deserved. Hoster couldn't help but grumble at the Stormlord's stupidity. Wasn't he aware that his own grandmother had been a Targaryen? Once the anger had passed, acceptance took its place. But of course not acceptance toward the Valyrians. No, Westeros would remain a death trap for them for a long time to come. The problem was that the old order had been irreparably destroyed, and a new one had to be built. King's Landing had been the bready biscuit of many southern lords, and now it was gone. This would undoubtedly change the economic landscape of Westeros dramatically. Eventually, many lords began exchanging letters. The insults like Rebel Oathbreaker and Dragon's Dog ceased. Some blood feuds even resolved on their own. The most shocking of these was undoubtedly the Blackwood and Bracken lords, who signed marriage pacts and declared an end to their unnecessary squabbles. Hoster Tully didn't believe in this peace. After all, these two families had once made peace with marriage, only to fight again shortly after. Still, the so-called temporary peace was a shocking event, and it perfectly illustrated the current state of Westeros. The Greedoom disaster had brought the country a horrific tragedy. But, oddly enough, it had also brought peace. Finally, the Lord Paramounts decided to convene a new Great Council in Maidenpool to determine the future of Westeros. Even Doran Martell, who was battling a serious illness, made the effort to attend the council. The first day of the council was crowded. Nearly all of Westeros' important lords were there. The first speech was delivered by the new High Septon of the Seven, who had replaced the old one, who had died during the Greedoom disaster. He declared the Targaryens a cursed family. He stated that all oaths sworn to them had been broken by the authority of the Seven, and from this day forth, anyone who had sworn an oath to them or served them would be cursed by the Seven. Next, Archmaester Walgrave, representing the Citadel Council, took the podium. His speech was long and tedious, but the summary was simple: almost every generation of the Targaryen family had a member with a broken mind. Aerys was not the only example from his family, just the most glaring one. In short, the Targaryens' bloodline was flawed, and madness passed from generation to generation under different guises. But only for those descended through the male line, he had quickly added, so as not to cast Robert Baratheon under suspicion. From this point on, the Lord Paramounts began to speak. The gist of it was simple: they desired peace for Westeros and would never serve the Targaryens again. On the second day, after lengthy discussions, a decision was made about how the Great Council would be organized. There would be no major meetings until the seventh day. Until then, both large and small lords were free to negotiate with one another, with the Lord Paramounts acting as mediators for these discussions. On the third day, Hoster mediated agreements between the lords. He arranged some marriages and fair trade agreements. By the fourth day, all the rebel leaders had gathered to reach a common decision, so they could move forward with a unified strategy at the Great Council on the seventh day. The 4 Lord Paramounts sat at the corners of the round table, each accompanied by 3 loyal bannermen of their choosing. Hoster's good son Ned was seated right next to him, and Lord Roderick Riswell sat just behind him, within earshot. From what Hoster had heard, his brother Bryndon had saved Lord Roderick Riswell during the Greedoom disaster, just before suffering a serious wound himself. At the time, Hoster hadn't known it, but after the Great Council ended, he would curse Bryndon endlessly, for saving Roderick Riswell. Notes. I enjoy reading fanfics about the Greedoom disaster, but there's one major issue in many of these stories: the Targaryens remaining in power. This family is already infamous for its madness, has repeatedly insulted the faith of the Seven, and has caused countless civil wars. After so many problems, and after such a catastrophic ending, why would anyone keep them on the throne? To invite another Greedoom. Thank you for reading. I believe this great council and its outcomes will surprise all of you. Chapter 3, Roderick. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. I don't know who started the tale that Northerners are uncultured barbarians who know nothing of politics and intrigue, but if I ever find them, I'll have their head, because Roderick Riswell fucked us all at the Maidenpool Council. Their sigil shouldn't be a horse, it should be a viper. Lord Mathis Rowan. Roderick's eyes scanned around the table. Hoster Tully furrowed his brows, listening silently and thoughtfully. John Arryn, with a patient expression, was weighing the conversation. Robert Baratheon looked bored, staring aimlessly at his wine-filled cup. And Ned Stark. When Roderick looked at his face, he realized that the man's thoughts were much deeper. The young Lord of Winterfell had fallen into complete silence after escaping the disaster. Well, it wasn't surprising, as he was already known as the Silent Wolf, but this silence was different from the previous ones. The old Ned Stark, despite being quiet, was certainly not an antisocial man, yet this time he was presenting a completely different portrait. He had sunk into his thoughts, completely overwhelmed by them, not focusing on the conversations around him. He was only checking the map, calculating something. Roderick did not find it logical for the young Lord Stark to mourn, as the North had suffered the least during the Greedoom disaster. Only 2,000 soldiers. It wasn't an insignificant loss, but it could have been much worse. If they had launched a full assault on the city after seeing the gates open. Just thinking about it sent shivers down Roderick's spine. During the Greedoom disaster, aside from the 2,000 northern soldiers, only 3 nobles had died. Old Andrew was already elderly, and he was aware that it could have been a trap when entering the city. Old Andrew's eldest son and heir had unfortunately been in the city during the explosion, but since the Locke family had plenty of male children, there would be no succession issues. And finally, Ethan Glover, as Roderick had heard, was rotting beneath the Red Keep, paying the price for following stupid Wolf Brandon, a nickname Roderick had given him, and whenever he thought of it, it made him feel better. Yes, the Greedoom disaster had been a real tragedy, but the North had not suffered much. In fact, the losses from the War of the Trident had been greater than those from Greedoom. So what was it that was making Lord Stark think so deeply? Roderick had thought it might be related to his lost sister, Lyanna. When he had asked about this matter the day before, Eddard Stark had looked at Roderick in surprise. Lyanna. Damn, I completely forgot about her, he had said, hastily getting up. I need to urgently send a few letters and speak to the lords who might know her whereabouts. Roderick had looked at Lord Stark in astonishment as he hurriedly left. A few months had passed since the Greedoom disaster, but until Roderick mentioned her name, Lyanna's fate hadn't even crossed Ned Stark's mind. Well, Gentleman John Arryn finally said, slamming his fist on the table and silencing everyone. You all know what happened, what we've been through, and why we're gathered here, so I'll skip the unnecessary pleasantries. He stood up and briefly surveyed those at the table. Now, the question is, who should we support as king, as the Rebel Alliance? What kind of question is this? Lord Ralph Buckler, sitting next to Robert Baratheon, scratched his ear. After the War of the Trident, all of you accepted Robert Baratheon as king and swore fealty to him. It seems you're mistaken, Lord Buckler. Hoster Tully interjected. Yes, we accepted him as our king, but we never bent the knee or swore an oath. We were waiting for the conquest of King's Landing to do that, but now that plan is no longer viable, he continued, laughing mockingly. Besides, on what legitimate grounds can Lord Robert claim to be king? Because his grandmother was a Targaryen. If he goes out and tells the people that, they'll tear him apart. As the debate in the hall grew louder, John Arryn repeatedly slammed his fist on the table, trying to silence the noise. Roderick sighed. Ah, those Southerners, they really had too much free time. He grabbed an empty cup, filled it with beer, then hurled the cup, filled with beer, into the fire burning on the hearth. The fire, tainted with alcohol, exploded noisily. Although no one was harmed, the sound was enough to make everyone fall silent and stare at Roderick in surprise. Roderick casually leaned back without caring about the looks. Robert John Arryn began, casting a grateful glance at Roderick. The original plan was to make you king, I admit that. But the circumstances have changed too much. King's Landing, the political and economic center of Westeros, is gone. The old order has been completely destroyed, and now we have to build a new one. We need to establish a new administrative and commercial center in place of King's Landing, or we will be economically crushed by the Essozi, perhaps even subjected to the horrifying fate of becoming their colony. Westeros could turn into a chessboard for the Essozi to move around as they please. We cannot allow that. He looked around at the other lords again. Robert, there are many things, especially in times of war, that I can't imagine a better leader than him. But he was never a good administrator, nor did he understand economic matters. It pains me to say this about my stepson, but Robert has incredibly expensive tastes, the kind of tastes that Westeros can't afford. He sighed deeply before sitting back down. Robert cannot be king, he concluded his monologue. A silence fell over the room. Robert Baratheon seemed somewhat hurt by what he had heard. Well, he said finally, I completely withdraw my claim to the throne. Robert. Stormlord's grandfather, Eldon Estermont, tried to intervene. Enough. Robert raised his hand sharply. Look, I'm a warrior, all right. Show me a target, and I'll crush it with my hammer. Even if it's a real dragon. He leaned back again. But counting copper, building cities, doing paperwork. That's not me. I know what I am, and I also know what I am not. I'm not some madman who sees himself as a chosen one like Rhaegar. He took a deep sip of Arbor wine. So I'll follow your decision. Well, who will be king? A silence lingered in the room. Roderick was also curious about the answer to this question. John Arryn, the one who had arranged this meeting, must have had a plan in mind. First John Arryn began, clearing his throat a few times, the king we choose must have the ability to reunite and strengthen Westeros. His family must have a deep history, otherwise, the other lords won't respect him or follow him. To ascend to the throne with sufficient support, he must be a Lord Paramount, or someone from his family. He spread a large map of Westeros on the table and began pointing to the kingdoms with his finger. Tyrell and Tully lack the necessary historical prestige. Some smaller knightly houses have a longer history than they do. No offense, Hoster. He pointed to the Stormlands. Robert already stepped back, and I don't think I need to repeat his reasons. He pointed to Dorne. The Martells and the Dornish are looked down upon by the southern kingdoms. They will never accept them as leaders. He pointed to the Westerlands. If Lord Tywine were still alive, we could seriously consider this matter. He met all the requirements, but his son Jaime, he's like Robert, not good at anything other than war. He pointed to his own region, the Vale. To be honest, I meet all the requirements. I can't claim to be the best option, but personally, I think I could do it. Roderick raised an eyebrow. Was the old falcon considering offering himself? But I'm old, very old, John Arryn continued, dispelling Roderick's thoughts. I have no health problems at the moment, but I know my time is limited, and I have no heir. The last sentence seemed to deeply sadden John Arryn. He swallowed for a moment. I cannot be king. Ned, the Stormlord suddenly shouted, jumping to his feet and pointing to his close friend. You're suggesting Ned for king, aren't you? He has all the qualities. The Stark family has more history and prestige than the Westerland's gold mines. There is no house older or more successful. Their ancestors defeated the others. They built Old Town and Storm's End. He laughed eagerly. And Ned has the administrative skills as well. He can unite the kingdom and build a new capital. The room instantly erupted with noise. The lords began discussing the matter loudly. Great Yonumber supported the idea with a loud roar, while Wyman Daly was busy praising the Stark families and Ned Stark's prestige, accomplishments, and abilities. Hoster Tully's eyes were shining with excitement at the prospect of his daughter becoming the Queen of Westeros. He had already started speaking to his own lords. Jon Arryn, however, had a sad look in his eyes. Roderick looked at his lord, Eddard Stark. The man was still wearing his typical Stark ice-cold expression, betraying none of his thoughts. If another man his age were in his position, his eyes would gleam with excitement at the prospect of being king, but it seemed like Ned didn't care about what was being said. Roderick realized, with great respect, that he understood. Ned was aware, as well, that such a scenario could never come to pass. He wasn't allowing himself to fall into false hopes. The noisy debate continued for several more minutes, and the voices seemed like they would never die down. Enough. Lord Stark said, taking his cup of beer and slamming it hard onto the table. After a few moments, everyone in the room fell silent. Robert Eddard Stark turned his head to his closest friend. I cannot be king. Why not, you? The old gods, Ned said. I believe in the old gods. The Sevens will never accept me. This is negotiable, said Hoster Tully. The Sevens' faith isn't as strict as it used to be. They granted many concessions to the Targaryens. If we speak to the new High Septon. That's the problem, Jon Arryn interrupted, cutting off the Fish Lord. The Sevens' faith gave many concessions to the Targaryens, ignored their practices that went against the faith, and as a result, we had Greedom. The most devout council will never make the same concessions again, and even if we somehow manage to convince them, the people won't accept it. The people's faith in the church is already severely shaken. How about converting to the faith of the Seven, Ned? Hoster Tully asked, looking at his good son with hope. I know it's a hard decision, but Westeros needs you as king. First of all, Ned Stark said, furrowing his brow slightly. I will not forsake the gods of my ancestors. I refuse to do so. He shot an angry look at his good father, Hoster Tully. Moreover, the North has worshipped the old gods for thousands of years. A Stark who rejects the gods of his ancestors will not be followed. Roderick couldn't help but nod in appreciation at this objective observation. The religion of the old gods wasn't as strict as the faith of the Seven, but the Northerners had followed it loyally for thousands of years. If Ned Stark were to choose the faith of the Seven as his religion, the North would be forced to choose between their ancient gods and a leader who worshipped the Seven. Some would undoubtedly choose loyalty to their gods, and they wouldn't allow a man who worshipped the Seven, Stark or not, to rule the North. This would spark a long-lasting rebellion. It wasn't hard to see. Let's get to the point, Lord Arryn, said the elderly Eldon Estermont in a weary voice. You called this meeting, so you must have a plan. Yes, I do. Jon Arryn cleared his throat a few times and then began to explain his main idea. In the current situation, it seems that there is no king suitable for selection. My proposal is that until this issue is resolved, Westeros should be ruled by a great council of Lord Paramounts. As long as we remain united as a rebel group, we will have the majority in the decisions we make, and... Suddenly, a loud burst of laughter echoed through the room. Roderick was laughing. He knew this was a huge disrespect, but he couldn't stop himself. He laughed so much that he had to hold his stomach to calm down. The looks directed at him were varied. Some were shocked, some were angry at his insolence, and others were simply curious. Frankly, Roderick didn't care about their opinions. I apologize, Lord Arryn, Roderick said, barely managing to regain his composure. I'm just curious to know what your brilliant plan is, and this, but he covered his mouth to stop laughing. Well then, I'd love to hear your brilliant idea, Lord Ryswell, Jon Arryn said, gritting his teeth. Ah, you'll regret saying that, Roderick chuckled again. Now, my time has come. He stood up and addressed the room respectfully. Lords, I am from the North, and we Northerners prefer to speak briefly and to the point, not with unnecessary excuses, but with the truth. He stood up, towering over everyone in the room. His shadow seemed to envelop the entire room, and his voice carried an undeniable authority. Roderick Riswell had never felt so powerful in his life. Here are the damn truths: Westeros, ruled by a great council, can't accomplish anything. Even the most trivial decisions would take months of negotiation. He began pacing around the round table. The lords watched him closely, their attention fixed on his every move. A king chosen by the Great Council will not come from a respected house. A house that rises through a council, not through war, will not inspire respect. I ask you, lords. Roderick slammed his hand on the table. Why do we need to clean up the mess the Targaryens left behind? Why do we make it our task to keep Westeros peaceful? We didn't break the peace, why must we be the ones to restore it? His eyes burned with intensity as he gazed at the lords around him. I ask you, what do the Tyrells, descendants of a worthless steward, mean to you? What do the Lannisters, whose arrogance exceeds their gold, mean to you? What do the Dornish, who sell their wives and daughters, and their leaders, the Martells, mean to you? Why must we protect them? Why do we need to keep them in peace and prosperity? Westeros' 300 years of unity is nothing more than a paradox. The unity the Targaryens brought only benefited the Reach and the Riverlands, while the rest of the kingdoms weakened and became dependent on others. He laughed again when he saw the fear on Hoster Tully's face. It seemed that Hoster had finally understood what was on Roderick's mind. Before the Targaryens, the North didn't trade with the southern kingdoms, yet we still fed ourselves and could muster an army of 30,000 men in times of war. Now, every time winter comes, we have to beg southern lords for wheat, and the number of soldiers we can muster for a rebellion barely reaches 18,000. He fell silent for a moment, knowing that similar situations existed in all the kingdoms, except for the Reach and the Riverlands. He gave them a moment to think about it. Finally, he spoke again. I say, let us return to our glorious days. I say, we need no one but each other. I say, let us put an end to this 300 years of stagnation and supposed peace. So, what do you say? He turned to Robert Baratheon, whose face was filled with excitement and eagerness. King of Storm, he said. Jon Arryn, thoughtfully tapping his fingers on the table, glanced up. King of the Vale. Roderick drew his sword and knelt before Eddard Stark. King of the North. Notes. Ha ha, I'm sure you didn't see this coming. In fact, you probably thought I would make Ned Stark the King of Westeros through a council decision. Sorry, but I have no intention of making things that easy. The path of Eddard the Unifier will be paved with sacrifices and blood. If you want to know what happens next, don't forget to subscribe, because I'll keep writing. And if I ever stop, I promise I'll let you know. Chapter 4, Kevan I. Chapter text. A lion crowned, but witless still. His reckless hand bends iron will. The rock may stand, yet fools may fall. And Kevan bears the weight of all. Tom of Seven Streams. Kevan could never have imagined witnessing the fragmentation of Westeros in his lifetime. Well, the decision to break apart had not yet been finalized, but in Kevan's eyes, it had already become inevitable. The idea had already gained the support of many lords, both rebel and loyalist. In truth, Kevan shouldn't have been surprised, he should have foreseen it. The political and economic center of Westeros had been destroyed. Keeping the realm together would be a difficult and hopeless struggle. The nobles of the Westerlands had mixed opinions. Some were drawn to the allure of returning to the days of the Kingdom of the Rock, stories they had grown up hearing since childhood. Kevan, deep down, was among them. The thought of the Lannisters once again ruling as kings of the Rock, answering to no one, was a tempting tale. But in the end, it was just that, a tale. Independence for the Westerlands would bring risks along with it. The greatest problem, without a doubt, would be the Iron Islands. Those savage barbarians would certainly take advantage of Westeros fragmentation, seeing the shores of the Westerlands and the Reach as a grand feast laid out before them. A significant portion of the Dornish lords already supported the idea. Though they were part of Westeros, they had always been looked down upon and treated with disdain by the other kingdoms. Returning to the days of their former independence, where they answered to no one, was an appealing prospect. The Reach would undoubtedly suffer the most from the realm's fragmentation. The Tyrells had barely managed to hold on to their Lord Paramount title for 300 years, but they had managed. but to become kings. That was an entirely different story. Would the Lords of the Reach truly follow a steward's bloodline as their royal house? Kevan wouldn't place bets on it. From what Kevan had heard, Olenna Tyrell was utterly horrified upon learning of the plans for fragmentation and was doing everything in her power to prevent it. She frequently met with rebel lords, attempting to reason with them. She had even tried to arrange a marriage between Robert Baratheon and her daughter Janna, but the Storm Lord rejected the offer, citing his betrothal to Lyanna Stark. The rebel leaders chose to remain silent on the matter of fragmentation, conducting secret negotiations among themselves. Robert Baratheon was eager to become the Storm King, but if the other two Lords Paramount decided otherwise, he would stand with them. The rebel lords, especially those in the north, already supported the idea of breaking away. And why wouldn't they? They would separate into 3 kingdoms, forging military and trade alliances. While the rest of Westeros was embroiled in conflict, they could tend to the wounds of war, turn the absence of King's Landing into an opportunity for trade, and sit in peace, adapting to the new order while the realm burned in chaos. The decision to fracture Westeros was far from the best course of action. It promised a new era of disorder. But for the rebel lords, it was undoubtedly the safest and most secure path. To be honest, if Kevan had been part of the rebel alliance, he would have supported fragmentation as well. The alternatives, electing a king or being ruled by a council, were not nearly as safe. If the realm truly shattered, the rest of Westeros would not dare to attack the rebels. Challenging 3 united kingdoms at once would be outright madness. The lords, even before an official agreement had been made, had already given it a name, the 3 Kingdoms Alliance. Kevan was regretful, truly regretful. His brother Geryon had insisted on joining the rebel side when Robert's rebellion began. If Kevan had listened to him, the 3 Kingdoms Alliance would have included the Westerlands, making it a 4 Kingdoms Alliance. This would have solved many of the potential problems that would arise from the Westerlands gaining independence, especially the issue of the Iron Islands. The Greyjoys would have thought twice before attacking the Westerlands shores, and even if they did, they would have had to face a powerful allied army. Kevan, for neither the first nor the last time, asked himself, what would Tywin do? It had been over a year since his brother's death, yet Kevan still sought his wisdom. Tywin had been born to lead, while Kevan had been born to assist him. That was the fate written for both of them since birth. But when there was no true leader, what was the assistant supposed to do? Jaime was many things, but he was certainly not a leader. Thinking about his brother stirred his anger once more. Kevan would never forget that day at the Harrenhal tourney, never. They had been humiliated by Aerys in front of all of Westeros. The Mad King had laughed as he mockingly described the pitiful details of Tywin's death, and his sycophants had laughed along with him. But that wasn't even the worst of it. Before making the official Lord Paramount declaration, Aerys had dined with the Lannister family. During the meal, he had gazed at Cersei with lust, licked his lips, and asked her to sit beside him. If Rhaegar hadn't been there to intervene, a rebellion would have started right then and there. Neither Jaime nor Kevan were the kind of men to sit idly by and watch Cersei be harassed. When news of the rebellion broke out, both Tigett and Geryon wanted to join, eager to punish the Targaryens for their insults, to make them experience their own version of the reigns of Caste Maria. Kevan hadn't been surprised by his brother's burning hatred for the Targaryens. What had surprised him, however, was that Jaime had more or less agreed with them. Jaime had always had good relations with Rhaegar and Arthur Dayne. When Kevan later asked him about it, his nephew had muttered through gritted teeth, what they wanted to do to Cersei. I can never forgive it. Regardless, Kevan had calmed his family's fiery rage and convinced them to take the most cautious path for the Westerlands. A Westerlands army gathered at Golden Tooth, but it was not meant to support the Targaryens. Not a single member of the main Lannister family had even considered fighting for them. If Jaime had made such a decision, he would have faced immense backlash. The Westerlands' position would be decided by the course of the war. If the rebels were crushed, they would offer some excuse like, we wanted to act, but we had no opportunity. If the Targaryens were defeated, they would join the rebels and help wipe out the remaining Targaryens. If the war dragged on without a clear outcome and the Westerlands had the power to tip the scales, they would side with the rebels and take the opportunity to give the Targaryens a proper beating. After all, the Lannisters always paid their debts. Then, they heard the results of the Battle of the Trident. Jaime was somewhat saddened by Roriger's death but was generally pleased with the rebels' victory, as was the rest of the family. Soon after, the rebels sent an offer of alliance. Under Robert Baratheon's rule, the Westerlands would receive various concessions and tax reductions. They also offered Benjen Stark as a match for Cersei. Jaime ignored the marriage proposal but agreed to join the rebels. If the Tyrells remained loyal to the Targaryens, he declared that he would take great pleasure in crushing them. He was young, his blood was hot, and a great war had taken place right beside him, yet he had not taken part in it. That frustrated him. Still, Kevan couldn't blame his nephew. Even for someone as old as himself, the prospect of glory in battle was tempting. If he had been at the Trident, Kevan could imagine himself tearing a hole through the famous Dornish shield wall. Luwin Martell, Jonat Hordiari, and Barristan Selmy, he could see himself facing them one by one on the battlefield. He was certain he could defeat the first two. Barristan, however, was another matter entirely. But to die at his hands would not be a dishonorable fate. What a glorious day it would have been. A tale for his grandchildren to tell for generations. Kevan, after receiving his nephew's approval, had written a letter declaring his acceptance of the rebels' offer. He had also ordered the Westerlands infantry to prepare in case the Tyrells acted foolishly and continued the war. However, before Kevan could send the letter of support to the rebels, they received the dreadful news: Greedum. Kevan had no close relatives residing in King's Landing, thank the Seven, but he had acquaintances and friends there. Real men, honorable men, and women of incredible willpower that could humble even the strongest of men. They had not deserved such a death. Kevan mourned for his friends, wept, and prayed to the stranger to grant peace to their souls. At times, he still wondered, what if Tywin had lived? Or if they had joined the rebellion from the very beginning? Could they have prevented Greedum? Was that truly a possibility? It was a question Kevan would never have an answer to, and besides, it was a pointless curiosity. He swiftly pushed such unnecessary thoughts from his mind. On the first day of the Maidenpool Council, Kevan was among the few who listened attentively to Archmaester Walgrave's speech, hearing in full detail the Targaryen family's 300-year history of catastrophe. The daughter of the old king and good queen Alysanne, Daela, had been considered a simpleton, afraid of books and animals alike. Aegon II's son, Jaehaerys, was born with 6 fingers, while his sister was mentally impaired. Good Daeron's son, Prince Rorigil, was prone to fits of madness and sickness, once found dancing naked through the halls of the Red Keep. Kingmaker's son, Aerion, had believed himself to be a dragon and drank a cup of wildfire. Baelor I had been killed by his own uncle for attempting to launch a crusade. The list went on, and the most terrifying part was that all of this had happened within just 300 years. No other noble house had suffered so many stillborns, physically or mentally afflicted children, not in such a short span of time. As Kevan listened to the Archmaester, he became convinced that the man was right. The Targaryen's blood was tainted and cursed. Roriger had shown the potential to be a good leader, but so had the young Aes once. Kevan now understood, Roriger had been just as mad as his father, only of a different breed and better at hiding it. Abducting a Lord Paramount's daughter was something even the lecherous Aegon IV would never have dared to do. Supporting the Targaryens had always been a great gamble. Yes, they had rulers like Jaehaerys I and Daeron too, but one could never predict when a Targaryen would go mad. At least now, they would never have to deal with them again. Good riddance. Kevan had already begun preparing for an independent kingdom in the Westerlands. If possible, he wanted to join the Three Kingdoms alliance, which would largely secure the kingdoms. He considered Robert Baratheon's hand for Cersei, though Lyanna Stark must have already passed away by now, the poor girl. As for Jaime, Janna Tyrell would be a suitable match. This way, the kingdoms of Westeros could at least be united through marriage. These unions would help make the chaos after the split much less painful. The real problem was Jaime. He had completely rejected all marriage proposals for both himself and his sister, showing a firm, unwavering stance on the matter. Cersei leaving Casterly Rock was out of the question. Moreover, Jaime already had a woman he wanted to marry. After telling his uncle this, Jaime had looked at Kevan and asked, "Uncle, if I become king, my word is law, and everything I want will happen, right? There was a strange gleam in his eye. Kevan began to fear what his nephew might do. He wished again that Tywine were here to bring his son to his senses. On the 7th day of the Maidenpool Council, the Grand Council convened again, and Roderick Ryswell carried out a highly effective propaganda campaign, almost guaranteeing the fragmentation of Westeros. Kevan had to admit the man was a very skilled politician. He knew how to rile people up. At the same time, he was cleverly exaggerating the glorious period when Westeros had been 7 kingdoms, using it to stir up further sentiment. In truth, the things the man said weren't lies or mistakes, just an exaggeration of numbers. The 18,000 soldiers that Eddard Stark had gathered for the rebellion had been a hastily assembled infantry force, and the Westerlands could have mustered at most 20,000 under similar circumstances. Still, Ryswell was right about the North's dependence on the South for grain. Targaryen's gift of the new gift to the Night's Watch had been a significant blow, greatly reducing the North's already limited grain production. The Adderlord, this was the new nickname for Roderick Ryswell, was skillfully blending truth and lies. The Tullys were another source of concern. The region they ruled, the Trident, was always at risk of war. There were 7 kingdoms in Westeros, and when 2 of them went to war, the impact always reached the Riverlands. The fragmentation of Westeros would spell disaster for them. Yet, their situation was not as dire as the Tyrells because their family had 2 queens. Now, the Tullys had 2 choices, join the North Kingdom or join the Vale Kingdom. Independence was certainly not an option. Kevan thought they would join the Vale Kingdom, as they were culturally closer to them, and if the Riverlands were attacked, the Vale army could respond much faster than the North. Hoster Tully's decision remained uncertain, but he needed to stop cursing Roderick Ryswell and seriously consider the matter, as he didn't have much time left to choose. In this time when the fragmentation of Westeros seemed inevitable, Kevan Lannister's choices were becoming increasingly difficult. With every step, he felt the weight of responsibility for both his family and the kingdom's future on his shoulders. But no matter how careful he was, he had to accept that every decision came with a price when walking a road that led to an uncertain end. Ultimately, as hard as it was, there was no other choice but to follow his own path if the Lannister house was to survive the storm. Chapter 5, Hoster 2. Notes. Background information. You may have noticed that sometimes I refer to it as Riverland, and other times as Trident or Trident. They all mean the same thing, I just prefer using different names in the sentence. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. Never underestimate the Tullys, my son. They are not easy opponents. They proved it in the Dance of the Dragons and Robert's Rebellion. Roderick Ryswell, Hand of the King of the Kingdom of the North, to his son and heir Roger Ryswell. To Winterfell we pledge the faith of Riverrun. We entrust our hearth and our crops to you. Our swords and spears are at your command. Grant mercy to the weak, help to the helpless, and justice to all. We will never abandon you. I swear on earth and water. I swear on bronze and iron. I swear by ice and fire. On the 10th day of the Maidenpool Council, it was clear that the fragmentation of Westeros was inevitable, and soon after, it was time for Hoster to make a choice, to join the North Kingdom or the Vale Kingdom. Independence was never an option. In the lands of the Trident, many kingdoms had been established before, with the most famous being House Mud, which had a history as old as House Stark. For 1,000 years, they had managed to hold the title of King of the Trident, successfully repelling every invasion attempt until the Andals came. They even resisted the Andals for a long time. But even a house as successful and glorious as House Mud could not save the Riverlands from its inevitable fate, and eventually, the kingdoms fell under the weight of invasion. Although several more kingdoms were established later, none were as successful as House Mud. Hoster, proud of his ancestors and the legacy of House Tully, was not arrogant or foolish enough to claim he could succeed where House Mud had failed. He certainly wouldn't place his money on such a high-risk wager. Once this matter was settled, the next question arose, which kingdom should he join? Outsiders probably considered the Vale Kingdom to be the most reasonable option for Hoster, as the Riverland people were culturally closer to them, and in the event of an invasion, they could quickly gather their forces to come to their aid. This was the situation from the outside, but what about for the Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, Hoster? The answer to this question, for several reasons, was a resounding no. First, the Vale Kingdom could not send troops every time the Riverlands were invaded, which happened frequently during the times of chaos. They had their own troubles, constantly engaged in active war with the mountain clans and coastal pirates. Second, protecting Riverrun was never going to be a priority for Jon Arryn. The most important product from Riverrun was wheat and grain. The Vale already produced enough wheat for themselves, so they wouldn't see the need to allocate significant resources to protect the Trident. What about for the north? Definitely not. It was true that after gaining independence, they would take back the rich agricultural area of New Gift, but they would have to deal with settling farmers in the region and building fortifications to protect it from the wildlings. All of these tasks would take a long time, and even if they succeeded, New Gift would never produce enough grain to sustain all of the north. Connecting the Riverlands to the north meant that this region would become the grain supply for the north, making it crucial for the North Kingdom to protect the Riverlands. They wouldn't hesitate to use all necessary resources and military power. This would solve the first two problems. It was true that there were religious and cultural differences between the Riverlands and the north, but Hoster was planning to arrange marriages between the lords of the north and the Riverlands. These marriages would intertwine the fates of both lands. Moreover, these nobles had fought together in Robert's Rebellion, so they already held great respect for one another. Men who fought side by side on the battlefield formed a bond stronger than that of blood relatives. Hoster had a third reason for choosing the north, and that was the issue of inheritance. Jon Arryn was old, had no heir, and it was doubtful that Lysa would give him one. The truth was that the foolish girl had managed to hide Petyr Baelish's bastard that she carried in her womb for a long time, and by the time Hoster found out, it was already several months along. Of course, Hoster could never accept such a disgrace to the family name, so he forced the girl to drink moon tea. After the procedure, Maester Vimen spoke with Hoster, informing him that the miscarriage had been very painful and traumatic. In short, the foolish girl might have lost her ability to give birth, and what use was a woman who couldn't bear children? Jon Arryn knew of Lysa's situation before marrying her, but he had accepted the marriage to solidify the alliance. Back then, his heir, Daenerys Arryn, was still alive and had 2 children, so even if Lysa didn't bear a child, there wouldn't have been an issue with the succession of the Vale. However, things didn't go as planned. Daenerys Arryn had died in the Battle of the Bells, and his sons had died in a disease outbreak in Gulltown. Now, Jon Arryn's heir was a young child named Harold Hardyne, a distant relative, and it was doubtful whether he would be qualified to become the future king of the Vale. In short, Jon Arryn urgently needed an heir, and it was highly unlikely he would be able to do this with Lysa, whose fertility was in question. Hoster was expecting Jon to divorce Lysa soon and find a more fertile woman, and even if he didn't, the idea of his grandchildren becoming the king of the Vale, if such grandchildren were even born, made linking the Riverlands to the Vale Kingdom a highly uncertain decision. What about the north? Definitely not. His eldest daughter, Catelyn, was a perfect copy of her mother, displaying all the qualities a woman should have. She was beautiful, fertile, and knew her duties as a lady. She had already given King Stark an heir and would give him more children. The North's succession was far from being in danger. And there was one final reason Hoster chose the North. It seemed like a minor reason on the surface, but it was significant to him. Hoster would rather jump through 7 hells than kneel in front of Lysa and address her as Your Grace. That arrogant and incompetent girl had managed to marry a Lord Paramount despite all her mistakes, but instead of showing gratitude to her father, she complained about Lord Arryn's sour mint scent. Hoster would pity any kingdom where she was queen. The rebels declared their independence in a ceremony held in front of the Maiden Pool Godswood. The ceremony was blessed by the High Septon, who personally crowned the 3 kings, making the declaration of kingship a public event in the presence of both the new and old gods. The area had already begun to be called the 3 Kings Square, and Lord Mouton spoke to Hoster about plans to establish a tavern and turn it into a tourist attraction. Hoster was not surprised. The Moutons had always been a family that knew how to make money. Eddard Stark became the first king in the north to be crowned by the High Septon in history, and this deeply disturbed some northern banners, though they were forced to accept it quietly. Ned Stark was now not only the king of the north, which still followed the old gods, but also the king of the Riverlands, which followed the 7. This meant he had to show respect for the seven, as the ceremony had taken place in front of a god's wood, so the three kings had given the proper reverence to the old gods as well. After the coronation, the three kings withdrew to a quiet room with their newly chosen council members to discuss the future of the alliance. Well, two kings discussed it, and the third one slept. Robert Baratheon, the new Storm King, had never been too involved in the matters of governance. The country's administration had mostly been left to his grandfather and the new king's hand, Eldon Estermont, and his brother Stannis, who had not yet been assigned any formal titles. Jon Arryn, on the other hand, was the complete opposite of Robert. Due to his old age, he had distanced himself from the matters of war. However, he was an expert in the matters of governance and politics, with years of experience. Thus, he made his choice for Hand of the King accordingly, selecting Yohn Royce. Eddard Stark, the good son and new king, made a choice that Hoster was not pleased with, though he understood the reasoning behind it. As the first Hand of the King in North history, he chose Roderick Risswell. Hoster hated that man, and had he the chance, he would have drowned him in a spoonful of water, but the Serpent Lord had proven himself an expert in politics and intrigue. Eddard lacked experience in this regard, as Hoster's good son had adopted too much of Andal culture during his time in the Vale. Thus, he would need someone like Roderick Risswell's help. As the Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, Hoster was the second most important person in the Kingdom of the North after the king himself. However, neither he nor his brother would take a seat at the small council, and the reason was simple. There would be a chaotic period following the fragmentation of the kingdom. Hoster and Brynden would have to remain in the Riverlands, constantly overseeing the Trident region. For this reason, he had spoken with Eddard and rejected all offers for seats beforehand. However, Riverland lords would undoubtedly take several seats at the small council. It was actually a funny situation. Despite the Targaryens being a cursed house, the three kings of the Rebel Alliance saw no problem in adopting their governing system. In fact, even the Kingsguard system had been taken. Robert had his Stormguard, Jon Arryn had the Winged Knight, and Eddard had the Wolfguard. Barristan Selmy had been chosen as the first Stormguard. After all, he was a marcher, and his homeland was Stormlands. However, no other members had been chosen yet. Hoster was determined that Riverland Knights would take the lion's share in the Wolfguard. When Hoster entered the hall, he heard Jon Arryn say, "Robert can't marry Janna Tyrell. The Tyrells are a dead investment. Adding the Reach to our kingdom would be a great advantage," murmured Eldon Estermont. "Lord Eldon, you weren't at the Battle of the Trident, so I think you're unaware of how many losses we sustained," King Stark explained. "After the battle, almost the entire Storm army was wiped out. Even if you annex Reach to your lands, you will undoubtedly have to fight, and right now, you don't have enough military strength. We also aren't in a position to allocate resources for any war," he continued with further details. "Reach is already under siege. I've heard Lord Quayan Greyjoy is raiding the coast." "All this talk is pointless," Robert Baratheon interrupted everyone. "I'm already betrothed, I'll be marrying Lyanna." "Ned, have you heard anything from her?" A grim expression appeared on Eddard Stark's face. "Unfortunately, I've asked the lords who've come to the council, but all we know is that they went to Dorne. Prince Doran swore he would search for her, and if he finds anything, he'll inform us." Speaking of Lyanna, Jon Arryn looked at Ned. "Where are Aerys' last three Kingsguard? Do you know anything, Sir Barristan?" "As I told King Stark before, the remaining three Kingsguard, Sir Arthur Dayne, Oswell Went, and Richard Longmouth, entered Dorne with Rhaegar and Lyanna and went into the Red Mountains, Your Majesty," Barristan Selmy reported respectfully. "Unfortunately, that's all the information I have. I'll offer a reward for any information," Jon Arryn assured. "I'm sure we'll learn something soon. Now, let's discuss how we'll split the Royal Navy. I recommend Stannis take command." "The Royal Navy?" Hoster exchanged a curious look with his brother Brynden. "Oh, you just arrived, so you don't know," Blackfish said. "During the Greedoom catastrophe, only part of the Royal Navy was in King's Landing, the remaining 120 ships are anchored at Dragonstone. After Rhaegar Targaryen fled, there's been no one to command them. Even if that woman had stayed, they wouldn't have served her," Brynden explained. "They want to pledge their loyalty to the Three Kings Alliance." Hoster experienced a pleasant surprise at this news. Despite the Three Kings Alliance being newly formed, it had already gained a fleet of 120 ships. This was truly good news. I demand that 5 ships stay in Maidenpool and 20 ships in Segard for protection. Ned's voice was heard. The remaining ships should be tasked with guarding the trade routes. Since King's Landing is no longer operational, Gulltown and White Harbor will largely take over trade with Essos. We also need to negotiate the timber flow and the expenses. Hoster thought to himself, I think I can understand that. He looked at the Storm King, who had fallen asleep at the table from boredom, with a sympathetic expression. This conversation was going to take a long time. Notes. Damn, for the last 2 chapters, I've been writing Madripool instead of Maidenpool and no one noticed. Laughing smiley. Chapter 6, Ashura. Summary. This chapter will feel more like an interlude. It's early to say this, and it might be a spoiler, but I believe this warning is necessary. This chapter contains suicide, so if such themes disturb you, I advise against reading it. In this chapter, you'll learn about the background of the rebellion, or rather, my version of it, and Lyanna's fate. I'll try to use a more emotional tone, so it will be somewhat different compared to the other chapters, less focused on strategy and politics, and more on emotions. I've given all the warnings. Now, let's begin. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. I fell in love with your mother the first night I saw her at Harrenhal. She fell in love with me the moment we danced. We barely knew each other, yet we were madly smitten. That was not the case with Caitlin. She was a proud and formidable woman. Our love was built over years of effort, with our love for our children as the cement, laid brick by brick. No one in this world knows me as well as Caitlin does. The truth is, my love for your mother was something that came naturally in many ways, whereas my love for Caitlin was built upon labor and dedication. Even to this day, I do not know which one was truer, stronger, or more genuine. King in the North, Eddard Stark, to his daughter Illyrius. No. We have arrived at the castle, Oswell went quietly announced. Ashura let out a long sigh as she gazed at the tower before her. Gull Tower was within walking distance of Gulltown. The tower belonged to House Shett, a knightly house sworn to the Royces, and it was currently serving as a temporary residence for 3 kings before they returned to their respective kingdoms. Ned is here, Ashura thought. Ned was no longer the sweet, silent wolf she had danced with at Harrenhal. He was the man who had led the Northern and Riverland armies into battle, the man who had drawn up the plans for the Battle of the Trident and brought about the end of the Targaryens, the man who was now king of the North and the Riverlands. And he was no longer Ashura's man. He belonged to Caitlin Tully. In just 2 years, everything had changed in unimaginable ways, and Ashura was one of the culprits behind that change. I should have refused Roriger when he wanted to take Lyanna, she thought. This thought crossed her mind 100 times a day. I should have refused Roriger. And Elia. Elia Martell, her dearest friend. She had always preferred the company of women over men, but when she appeared at the tourney of Harrenhal, it became clear that she and Roriger had surprisingly similar tastes. Both of them had fallen for Lyanna Stark. At first, neither Ashura nor Arthur was too worried about the situation. They saw the whole affair as a fleeting amusement. But when Elia summoned them and said Roriger intended to take Lyanna as his second wife, everything changed. The worst part was that this unbelievably terrible plan had been conceived by Elia herself. Arthur and Ashura had a heated argument with Roriger and Elia that day. They tried to explain what madness it was to abduct the daughter of a paramount lord, but neither of them listened to the Dane siblings. Roriger was obsessed with the prophecy, convinced that the third head of the dragon would come from Lyanna. And Elia, she was simply in love with the Stark girl. When she spoke of her, a dreamy look appeared in her eyes. During the tourney of Harrenhal, when the two of them were together, Ashura had never seen her friend so happy. The husband and wife stopped pleading and trying to persuade others after a while. Instead, they exercised their royal authority and issued orders. Arthur was a Kingsguard, and Ashura was Elia's lady-in-waiting. Neither of them had any choice but to obey orders and take part in this madness. Ashura could never have foreseen things turning out this way. She had thought the worst outcome would be Lyanna being sent home in shame. But the rebellion. Greedom. These were things Ashura had never even considered possible. The gods were truly cruel. First came the news of the Battle of the Trident. Then, shortly after giving birth to her son, Lyanna had died of childbed fever. Ashura blamed Roriga for her death. To keep Lyanna from learning what had happened to her father and brothers, he had locked her away in an invisible cage, sealing her off from the world in a distant tower. He didn't even trust the Maestas, ranting about some conspiracy of theirs, and because of that, Lyanna had been denied proper medical care. Only Wyla, Starfall's midwife, had been allowed to tend to her. Even securing that permission had been a struggle for Arthur and Ashura. Before she died, Lyanna had begged Arthur and Ashura to take her son to Winterfell. She kept insisting that her father and brothers would protect the child. Lyanna never learned of her father and brothers' pitiful deaths, just as she never learned of Greedoom. Ignorance truly was bliss. After Lyanna's death, the three Kingsguard began discussing the restoration of House Targaryen. Their priority was to rescue Elia and her children and establish contact with Queen Rolla, who was residing on Dragonstone. They left the tower with the intention of taking the child and heading to Sunspear. However, when they arrived at Starfall, the sight that greeted them was shocking, to say the least. The streets of Starfall were empty. There wasn't even a single soldier on the walls, and the gates had been left open. It was as if all the people had vanished like ghosts. To say that Arthur and Ashura were bewildered would be an understatement. They didn't see a single soul until they reached the Dane Keep. Upon entering the castle, they found the September packed to the brim with people. Some were crying, some sat in silence, and others prayed in deep sorrow. Shortly after, a guard arrived and informed them that their elder brother, Alaric Dane, was waiting for them beneath the heart tree. House Dane had always held a rather scattered stance on religion. Ashura's father and elder brother worshipped the old gods, while her mother, Arthur, and Ashura herself followed the seven. When Ashura and Arthur arrived at the Godswood, they found their brother kneeling before the heart tree, praying alongside a small gathering. When Arthur asked why the city was empty, Alaric told him that it was by his order. During such times of catastrophe, noble and commoner alike should be on their knees, begging the gods for mercy. And then, they learned what had happened, Greedoom. For the next few weeks, Ashura locked herself in her chambers, forced to face the nightmares of the catastrophe she had helped bring about. During those days, the only solace she had was her daughter, Illyria. Illyria was perfect. She carried pieces of both Ned and Ashura. She represented the future they had never lived and never would. A future that Ashura had ruined. In those painful days, Ashura would cling to her daughter and weep. As if trying to comfort her mother, Illyria would pat Ashura's cheeks with her tiny hands and babble to herself. She carried so much of Ned within her, she was a remarkably quiet and calm baby. A few weeks later, Arthur came to her, disheveled in both hair and clothing, and told her that a great council was being held in Maidenpool. Had heard that ever since learning of Greedoom, Arthur had drowned himself in drink, becoming nothing more than a vagabond. He had passed out in the stables more than once and had even broken his Kingsguard vows by lying with a few women. Ashura only learned later that one of those women was pregnant. However, the news of the Maidenpool Council had given her brother a new sense of energy. He now looked at her with a completely different light in his eyes. He told Ashura that they had a chance to redeem their great mistakes. Roriga and Lyanna's son Daeron would be presented to the Great Council, and he would recommend him as the new king. Ned Stark would undoubtedly support his nephew, the Riverlands would follow him, and Jon Arryn could be persuaded. The Tyrells would undoubtedly remain loyal to the Targaryens. Arthur claimed that without Daeron, the realm would fall apart, but as long as Westeros remained united, the wounds of Greedoom could be healed. When Ashura heard her brother's brilliant plan, she screamed at him and threw everything she could grab in his face. Arthur seemed unaware of the widespread hatred for the Targaryens in Westeros, or he was deliberately ignoring it. Even in Starfall, Targaryen banners were being burned, dragon statues were being cursed and destroyed, and the situation in Old Town was even worse. Silver-haired Valyrians were being hunted down. Exposing little Daeron's identity would only lead to the poor child's early death. Arthur remained completely silent in response to his sister's screams but held firm in his resolve. After a while, he donned his Kingsguard sword and armor, met with his two companions, and shared his plans with them. Ashura didn't know how the conversation progressed, but Arthur's two Kingsguard companions drew their swords on him. Richard Lunmouth died by Arthur's hand, and Oswell had managed to kill his old friend with a treacherous move at the last moment. But this victory did not come without a price. Oswell had a large, ugly sword scar right in the middle of his face. A farewell gift from Dawn's sword. After Arthur's death, the only thing left to do was to face the consequences of their mistakes. Oswell found a ship heading to Gulltown, from where they would sail to White Harbor, then go to Winterfell, deliver Lyanna's coffin to Ned, and face their judgment while telling King Stark the truth. When they arrived in Gulltown, they learned that Eddard was still in the Vale, negotiating the last details of the Three Kings alliance. After his work was finished, he planned to take a ship to White Harbor. Oswell and Ashura found him at Gull Tower. They were escorted to King Stark's chambers by Lyn Corbray, the first member of the Winged Knights. At first, Oswell spoke alone with King Stark. He gave him the coffin, confessed his sins, and said that he would allow himself to be executed if the king wished. King Stark gave Oswell a look. Oswell had once been famous for his dark sense of humor. He was known for maintaining his humor even in the most dire of situations. Even if no one else laughed, he would, and he'd say that his own laughter was enough. Some of his jokes were considered disgusting, but Oswell didn't care what others thought. At least, that's how he used to be. After learning of Greedoom, Oswell had been completely broken. He was no longer even a shadow of his former self. He had a huge sword scar on his face, his arms were weak and frail, and his eyes were dull and lifeless. He seemed to have lost his humanity and had turned into a mere puppet. King Stark pitied the man. He judged that Oswell had already punished himself enough and told him to leave. When Ashura last spoke with Oswell, she learned that he was going to Old Town, where he would dedicate himself to the Seven in penance. Then, the one who was called was herself. Ashura was trembling as she went to meet the man she loved, with two babies in her arms. As Ashura tightly held the babies in her arms and approached the door, her heart began to pound in her chest. How long had it been since she last saw Ned? 2 years. It felt like a lifetime. She pressed her hands against the wooden door and took a deep breath, but no breath could lighten the weight inside her. The silent footsteps echoing in the corridor stopped as she pushed the door open and entered. The room was lit by the flickering light of a burning fireplace. Ned stood by the window, looking out at the Gulltown harbor. His back was turned to her, but Ashura could feel the tension in his body. The man slowly turned, and his eyes met Ashura's. In that moment, it felt like time had stopped. The young man Ashura remembered from her mind wasn't the shy, silent wolf she danced with at Harrenhal anymore. The man in front of her was a king carrying the weight of war and loss. The lines on his face were sharper, his gaze heavier. But in his eyes, there was still a deep sorrow, just like before. Ned's gaze slowly shifted to the babies in Ashura's arms. His lips parted slightly, but he didn't speak. Silence was the heaviest truth between them. Finally, Ashura spoke with difficulty. "I brought your nephew." Ned's face tightened. His steps were slow, but he moved toward Ashura. He had already learned of Daeron's existence from Oswell moments ago. When the woman extended one of the babies toward him, Ned raised his trembling hands. He gently took the baby, looked at him, and the stern expression on his face softened. "Daeron," he whispered. Ashura shook her head. "It was Lyanna's last wish. She wanted you to take him to Winterfell." Ned looked at the baby in his arms for a long time, then raised his eyes to Ashura. "And the other?" Ashura held the other baby closer. "Illyria," she said, her voice trembling. "Our daughter." Ned hesitated to hold Illyria, but when the baby reached out to him with tiny hands, he broke his resistance and opened his arms. Ashura watched him, and as their eyes met, a deep void formed in her heart. Ned gently touched the baby's head. "A little Stark," he said, a faint smile appearing at the corner of his lips. His eyes softened, and as he cradled Illyria, every movement was careful and gentle. As a father, that natural, protective love from deep within his heart slowly took its place. "She's beautiful, Ashura," he murmured. "Our daughter is perfect." Ashura looked at him with tears in her eyes, biting her lip to stay quiet. As Ned caressed Illyria's head, he felt the peace that came from touching her soft, tiny skin. The little girl's eyes, just like her mother's, were deep and strangely familiar, but at the same time, they felt like a future carrying the weight of the past. Ned tore his eyes away from Illyria and turned slowly toward Ashura. Amidst the chaos and emotions within him, a silent question arose as he watched her. His eyes carried a reflection from those days long ago, from another world. "Ashura," he said, his voice hardened, but there was a fracture deep within it. "Why are you here?" And that day, Ashura and Ned talked until nightfall. Ashura told him about the events that had started the rebellion, and Ned shared what he had experienced during it. "How will you protect the child?" Ashura asked, indicating Daeron. "I'll claim him as my bastard," Ned said with a sigh. "Most likely, they'll think he's your child already. When they saw you bringing the baby into the room, they'll think he's Illyria's twin, but the age gap is too obvious." He paused for a moment. "I'll send Daeron to Howland, raise him at Greywater Watch until he's old enough. When they are both old enough, Daeron," he looked at the baby again. John will grow to Illyria's size, and the age gap between them will become indistinguishable. Then I'll take him to Winterfell and raise him with my other children." Ashura simply nodded in approval. Ned's plan seemed the best. Little John was no longer Ashura's concern. Ashura looked into Ned's eyes. "Ned," she whispered, approaching him and taking his hands into hers. "Tell me." Ned looked at Ashura in surprise. "Tell you what?" "Greedoom." "No, this." "Tell me, please," Ashura said, as tears ran down her face. "If you truly love me, tell me. Let me face my sins." Ned looked at her, conflicted, but eventually, he opened his mouth and began to speak. And Ashura listened. It was night, and at the top of Gull Tower, Ashura was alone. A silence, unique to the night, had settled over the high cliffs and the dark sea. The sky, like a black shroud, enveloped everything in its intoxication, with stars flickering like distant memories. The sea, crashing against the rocks with a melody that intoxicated the night, whispered echoes of a faraway destruction. At the top of the tower, as the cold wind slapped against her face, her eyes were fixed on the sea. Every wave that struck the rocks resonated like a scream. Her heart began to race. There was a weight inside her, light as a feather but just as deadly, and in that moment, Ashura understood the inevitable. She did not have the strength to bear the weight of her sins, her mistakes. She did not have the strength to look after her daughter, to protect her, to be a mother. She did not have the strength to fight to get her love back. She felt herself slipping in a blood-slickened haze, and as pain and sorrow throbbed like a pulse, she took a step. The world fell away, and the sea rose as if to greet her like an old friend. Notes. Writing drama has never been my area of expertise, but I did my best in this chapter. Gull Tower isn't a castle I made up, it actually exists in canon, though its exact location is unknown. It's assumed to be in Gull Town. To shape the story I wanted, I took some creative liberties. Thank you for reading. Feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative. I'm open to all kinds of criticism. Except for the ridiculous ones. If anyone says, the Targaryens should have stayed in power after Greedoom, I'll be laughing my ass off. Chapter 7, Eddard 2. Notes. I won't be pushing the Ashura/Ned drama any further. As I mentioned in the fanfic description, this is not a drama-heavy story but one focused on politics and intrigue. I believe these 2 chapters should be enough for those who enjoy Ned/Ashura. Robert's Rebellion 283 AC. Maidenpool Council 284 AC. Chapter text. Gull Tower is located on the northwestern shores outside the city of Gulltown. The old, ruined castle was restored and transformed into a holiday resort 40 years ago through the dedicated efforts of City Mayor Dean Hunter. The tragic story of Ashura Dane, who was allegedly King Eddard the Unifier Stark's first love and the woman he could never forget, who threw herself from the Gull Tower, remains an inspiration for books, songs, plays, and films to this day and continues to attract tourists to the region. During the holiday season, the tower attracts a great number of visitors. Beneath the window from which Ashura Dane is said to have leapt, there is an inscription carved into the stone by City Mayor Dean Hunter himself. "The star fell from here. And the Wolf King wept." Gulltown Travel Guide, AC 721. Majesty, the letter you've been waiting for from Lord Wyman has arrived, Mayor Stillowin reported respectfully. Eddard quickly took the paper from the Mayor's hand and checked it with some urgency. The things he read soon made him relax, and with a smile, he showed the letter to the men around him. "The negotiations have had a positive outcome," he announced happily. "The Company of the Rose is returning to the kingdom and will serve as an elite military unit." The Company of the Rose was a mercenary group that had formed after the king Hunel Torhen Stark kneeled before the Targaryens, consisting of some nobles and soldiers, and was founded by King Torhen's brother, Brandon Snow. The group had never severed its ties with the North, and even today, retired soldiers who had fought in that army could be found in Winterfell, some of them in command positions. Some of the third or fourth sons of northern noble houses would join the group in hopes of a better future and adventure. Brandon, his older brother, often dreamed of joining the group and embarking on free adventures in Essos. Now, the North had regained its independence, and the Company of the Rose was returning home. Not to serve as mercenaries, but to settle as the kingdom's professional army. Eddard was considering renaming them the Winter Army and assigning them to patrol the Riverland borders. His good father, Hoster Tully, feared a future in which the Riverlands would be invaded, and the presence of a 4,000 strong professional army would greatly ease his worries. Eddard had sworn to his good father that he would protect the Trident no matter what, and he was determined to keep that promise. The Riverlands were the grain store of the North, and every lord in the North understood the critical importance of its protection. However, feeding an army of 4,000 professional soldiers would place a burden on the kingdom's treasury, and the kingdom needed new sources of income. Eddard had ideas like using the Riverland watermill model to increase timber production and build sawmills, but even if this idea was implemented, it was uncertain whether the North would earn enough gold, and there was a clear reason for this. The North's biggest buyers of timber and leather were in Essos. After the Greedoom disaster, an anti-Valyrian movement began to form across West Eos, which essentially meant facing off against more than half of Essos, as most of the cities on that cursed continent had been founded by the Valyrian Empire. Some even proudly called themselves the Daughters of Valyria and took pride in their Valyrian heritage. The city of Braavos, which had the best relations with the North in Essos, was known as the bastard daughter of Valyria, and due to historical reasons, its relations with its parents and the other daughters of Valyria were not very good. The North had suffered very few losses in the Greedoom disaster, which meant that, compared to other kingdoms, they did not harbor much Valyrian hatred. However, this did not mean that they were treated well. The executions of his father and brother were still remembered, as they had happened just 3 years ago. Anyway, trade relations with Braavos were still in good condition. However, trade with them alone would not be enough to enrich the North. Relations with Pentos and Myr had deteriorated. Pentos was the closest Essos port city to the North, while Myr was the producer of the necessary glass greenhouses for the North. Ned would need to exert some effort to repair relations with them. Ned wrote letters with specific instructions to Lord Marndale and his good father, Hoster Tully, asking them to prepare for the arrival of the Company of the Rose. Especially Blackfish had a lot of work to do because Ned would assign him to command the new army. After closing this matter, he began reviewing other letters. Lord Giamormontzer, Jorah, had married Lord Bracken's daughter and had a September build for her on Bear Island. Ned received this news positively. Recently, marriages between Northern and Riverland lords had increased. Both Hoster and Ned had supported these marriages, although there was still a cultural, especially religious, divide. Ned had had a September built in Winterfell for his wife, Catelyn, and had encouraged houses marrying Riverland ladies to do the same. This encouragement had angered more conservative northern houses like the Karstarks and Umbers. Ned's coronation by the High Septon had already been an unwelcome situation, and this encouragement had only added to the discontent. Some had even gone as far as to claim that Ned worshipped the Seven, not the old gods. However, everyone living in Winterfell knew that Lord Stark woke up at dawn every day to visit the Heart Tree. Furthermore, Ned was the man who led the Northern army in battle, winning victories, so his reputation as a ruler was not easily shaken. Ned would have liked to say that he understood the reactions of the more conservative northern houses regarding the September in Winterfell, but honestly, he didn't. The religious war between the worshippers of the Seven and the old gods had not been fought for thousands of years. The two religions were not contradictory to each other, they shared common taboos, such as strictly forbidding incest and slavery. Over thousands of years, these two sides had learned to respect one another. So what if he had a September built in Winterfell? Most of the southern noble houses had a godswood and a heart tree. Well, it wasn't a real heart tree, it was usually a large oak with a face carved into it, which they called a heart tree. They did this mostly to show how deep their history went. Even houses in the Reach, though they called themselves Andals, considered themselves descendants of the first men and didn't see it as something to hide. Even House Hightower had a godswood in their garden. After all, there was no other house in Westeros that could claim to be as old as the Starks. In any case, the southern houses showed at least a minimal level of respect for the old gods, and northerners could do the same for the Seven. It wouldn't hurt. As for the matter of the Seven's religion, Ned had started watching them closely because, after the Greedoom disaster, the church was undergoing a reform. The actions of the High Septons during the Targaryen era were being scrutinized, and the laws they had written were being reviewed. Even the writings about bastards being the seeds of sin had been completely removed and banned from the Seven's religion. The reform in the Seven's faith was showing positive signs for now, but danger loomed on the horizon. The result of this reform could be bad for the North. If the Zealots used the reforms to enter the most devout councils and stoke the old flames of hatred against the old gods, Eddard did not want to deal with a crusade. On the other hand, there was the situation in the Reach. Ned was expecting a civil war in the region as soon as the council was over, but fortune had smiled upon the Tyrell family. Lord Quayan Greyjoy of the Iron Islands had seized the opportunity of the Maidenpool Council and started raiding the Reach. As soon as Lord Mace Tyrell returned home, his first move was to gather an army and attack the Ironborn. By an extraordinary stroke of luck, they managed to find and kill Lord Quayan Greyjoy in the first attack. This success was a fluke, but unlike the Battle of Ashford, it was not a stolen victory. Lord Mace Tyrell had truly managed to drive the Ironborn out of the Reach in one swift move. This success had raised both his and his house's reputation, securing their position as leaders. Therefore, there was no internal strife in the Reach at the moment, but that was only for now. The lords had retreated to their castles, drawing their swords, preparing for war. The Reach was a volcano that would eventually erupt, and even if they joined the Three Kingdoms alliance, this would not change. For this reason, Jon Arryn and Ned saw the Reach as a dead investment and closed the door to all offers from the Tyrells. The Three Kingdoms alliance had just ended a war, they wouldn't jump into a new one so quickly. The wolf, the stag, and the falcon were victorious but wounded. They needed time to lick their wounds. The Three Kingdoms alliance. There was really only good news on this front. No alliance in history had been as strong as this one. Robert and Ned were stepbrothers, Jon Arryn was like a father to them. They would leap into fire for each other without hesitation. Moreover, all three were still quite healthy, so they would continue to rule for a long time. The lords of the kingdom were men who had fought together, and they all respected each other. Even the most conservative lords of the north no longer looked down on the southerners, and the southerners had stopped seeing the northerners as barbaric pagans. There were still occasional tensions, but the relationships between the lords were at a good level. Even a man like Roose Bolton had managed to find a few friends. There were no noteworthy events happening in the Westerlands for now. Jaime Lannister had declared himself King of the Rock in a grand ceremony, but that was all. It was unclear who he would choose as his queen or who he would marry his sister Cersei off to. This matter actually surprised Ned, as he had expected Cersei's hand to be offered to Robert. The Westerlands were not like the Reach, they weren't a boiling pot about to explode, and they were very wealthy. This meant that, in exchange for protection, they could provide the necessary gold for the development of the Alliance's countries. So, it was plausible to consider them joining the Alliance, but no offer had ever been made, and it seemed like they weren't considering making one. Ned was curious about what was on the Lannisters' minds. As far as Ned knew, Dorne's internal political situation was stable, but they were suffering from the anti-Valyrian ideology, particularly their deteriorating relations with Lys. A war was expected to break out soon in the Stepstones, which affected the commercial security between Westeros and Essos. This meant that the Three Kingdoms alliance would need to seriously monitor this situation. And lastly, the Iron Islands. Ned was keeping an eye on them, or rather, everyone was keeping an eye on them. The barbaric sons of Hors would undoubtedly take advantage of the fragmented situation in Westeros. Yes, Mace Tyrell had driven them out of the Reach, but they hadn't inflicted serious damage to their armies or ships. They had merely killed Quayan Greyjoy by sheer luck. The reason for the retreat of the Ironborn was the loss of their leader, not the loss of the war. Balon Greyjoy, who had declared himself king of the Iron Islands, was a man who supported restoring the old order. Victorian Greyjoy was a disciplined soldier and a capable commander who would cause trouble on the battlefield, and Euron. Ned thought the rumors about him were absurd. Not even an Ironborn could be so inhuman and devilish. Ned had stationed extra soldiers at the castles on the western coast of his kingdom, particularly Seaguard, which was at risk. The Mallister family had been allies of the Starks for generations, and if the Starks did not defend them, their reputation as a noble house would be tarnished. However, Ned did not expect the Ironborn to attack the northern kingdom's coasts. Why would they make such an incredibly foolish move to attack less wealthy lands like the North and Riverlands when there were larger feasts to be had in the Westerlands and Reach? There was no reason for it, but still, you never knew what was going through the minds of the Ironborn bastards. It was wise to be prepared. Majesty. A servant hurried in, bowing. Queen Catelyn is here and wishes to see you. Ned sighed. His new wife was certainly stubborn. All right, let her in, and clear the room, he instructed. It wouldn't be good for the king and queen to be seen arguing. After a while, as instructed, the room was cleared, and Queen Catelyn entered. Ned looked at her sternly from across the table. Majesty, you didn't come to dinner, Catelyn asked, elegantly gesturing with her head. I am ruling a newly established kingdom, and I am busy, Ned replied in a flat tone. You are not too busy to visit your bastard daughter every day, Catelyn reminded him in a disapproving voice. Shall I remind you that you have a son and your heir? I remember my son and my heir, and I visit him every day, Ned reminded her, standing up. However, I don't need to worry about my son's protection and care in Winterfell. The same does not apply to my daughter. You can't mean this. Catelyn stopped speaking formally, her face contorted with anger. What kind of woman do you think I am? Since I brought her to the castle, you've objected to Illyria's presence. I'm only saying that true-born children shouldn't live under the same roof as bastards. You can leave your daughter to grow up somewhere more appropriate, just like you did with your bastard son. Royal bastards are dangerous, Your Majesty. I will not send my daughter away. Stop bringing this up. This argument was severely damaging Ned and Catelyn's relationship. Catelyn paused for a moment, then looked carefully at Ned's face. Is this about Ashara Dayne? She asked. You can't forget her, and... At that moment, Ned's face darkened, and he slammed his hand on the table. Catelyn, who saw this, recoiled in fear. It was the first time she had ever seen her husband like this. Ashara Dayne, did Catelyn think Ned still loved and longed for her? No, Ned didn't love her, he hated her, he abandoned her, he abandoned his daughters in this cruel world to atone for something he had no sin in doing. Did she think she was some kind of saint? No, she was a coward, she was just a coward. She ran away from her duties, and in doing so she shattered Ned's heart. She made him feel guilty. Ned hated her and hated himself for continuing to love and miss her inwardly. The quiet wolf was unprepared for such turmoil of thought and was imprudent. If possible, he would like to forget Ashara completely and erase her from his mind. He really thought he could have done it if their daughter Illyria hadn't stood there as a living example of her mother. You will not speak of that woman to me, Queen Catelyn Tully Stark, this time using her full name. When he raised his head and looked at the woman, he saw her fear, and he felt ashamed of himself. He relaxed his body and softened his expression, walking over to his queen and placing his hand on her arm. Catelyn, he said, looking directly into her eyes with all sincerity. I swear, any daughter born of us will be loved by me just as much as Illyria. I swear, neither Illyria nor Jon will ever pose a threat to your children's inheritance. Just don't ask me to do this. Ned sighed. How could his wife expect him to cast away his daughter? He loved her so much, and he was proud of her. Don't force me to choose between my daughter and my wife. There was silence for a while. Swear it, Catelyn finally said. You will not legitimate those bastards. Swear it. But Illyria is a girl. She can't be a threat to Rob's inheritance. Ned tried to reason with her. No, swear it, Catelyn insisted. Swear it, and I'll never bring this up again. Ned took a deep breath. If this vow would ensure his daughter's safety and a peaceful childhood, he would make it. I swear. Chapter 8, Stannis I. Notes. King Eddard Stark, ruler of the North and the Riverlands, but he will only be referred to as the King in the North. King Jon Arryn, ruler of the Vale. In this series, he will be called King of the Vale. King Robert Baratheon, ruler of the Stormlands and the Crown Lands. In this series, he will be called the Storm King. King Jaime Lannister, ruler of the Westerlands. In this series, he will be called the Rock King. Prince Doran Martell, the Dornish have regained their independence, but they did not claim the title of king. Just like before Aegon's conquest, they continue to use the title Prince of Dorne. Lord Mace Tyrell, ruler of the Reach. Since he has not yet been crowned, he is not referred to as a king. The Tyrells are currently independent from any ruler, yet they are not considered a royal house either. Robert's Rebellion 283 AC. Maidenpool Council 284 AC. This section 287 AC. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. One of the noble ladies from the Reach who had come to seek refuge in the castle entered Lord Stannis's chamber, stripped herself bare, and lay on his bed waiting for him. When Lord Stannis walked in and saw the scene, he told the woman that King Robert's room was on the other side. From the personal journal of Maester Cresson. Dear Stannis, loving a man like you is like sitting on a throne as hard as a rock, waiting for warmth. The laughter of the room echoed as Robert read one of the love letters Stannis had received, imitating a woman's voice. Stannis gritted his teeth and cursed Lady Delaena Florent, who had written this ridiculous letter. He didn't care much about the sycophants inside, but it was truly frustrating to see even Sir Barristan holding back his desire to laugh. Your Majesty, there are important news about the Navy. Stannis wanted this nonsense to stop immediately. Wait a minute. Robert raised his hand. Here comes the best part. Listen, the furrow of your brows is a work of art, your silence is like poetry. They say you never smile, but I know, deep down, you've smiled at least once. This time, the entire room burst into laughter, even Sir Barristan couldn't hold back. Stannis clenched his fists in anger and silently swore that he would close the door to any letter from the Reach from now on. After the Maidenpool Council, Stannis had become one of the most popular marriage candidates in Westeros. Especially the Lords of the Reach wanted to marry their daughters to Stannis, hoping to secure themselves in the protection of the Three Kingdoms alliance in the upcoming civil war. After Robert married Lady Aelia Penrose and made her his queen, the only options left for lords who wanted to link themselves to the Three Kingdoms alliance were Benjen Stark and Stannis. As a result, the marriage proposals to Stannis had aggressively increased, and he had started to be drawn into various political schemes. While Stannis was walking normally along the Storm's End shores, suddenly a young lady would cling to his arm, pressing her chest against him and casting flirtatious looks, or she would pretend to faint in front of him, trying to create a romantic scene once he held her up. Stannis didn't know what to do in such situations and found himself in a position he never imagined, asking his older brother for advice about women. He needed his brother's wisdom to get rid of these irritating ladies without stepping outside of his knightly honor. Although the training he received from the king had been unpleasant for Stannis, the fact that the king had time to deal with such silly matters was a whole other topic. It had certainly been helpful, and Stannis' life had become easier. Stannis briefly wondered whether Benjen Stark was dealing with the same issues, but after thinking about it for a while, he concluded that this was unlikely. After all, Winterfell was far away and cold, and these crazy Reach ladies wouldn't travel all the way there to marry. Or would they? Actually, no, Queen Catelyn was a conservative woman, she wouldn't let such women into her home. Stannis decided that Eddard Stark's brother was a lucky bastard. Eddard Stark and Jon Arryn had closed the door to any relationship with the Reach at the Maidenpool Council, and Robert, like a docile man, listened to what they had said. This caused some unrest among the Storm Lords, especially as rumors spread about the suspicious intentions of the other two kingdoms' rulers. However, their voices weren't very strong. The nobles of the Three Kingdoms alliance were all men who had fought together against the Targaryens, and their bond wouldn't break easily. Still, Stannis wholeheartedly approved of this decision. Marrying Janna Tyrell and binding the Reach to Storm's End seemed like a great opportunity on the surface, but the situation wasn't that simple. The Stormlander army had lost a significant number of soldiers after the Trident War, and they would need time to rebuild. They didn't have the resources to devote to the Reach civil war. The Reach was on the verge of exploding, and even if they joined the Three Kingdoms alliance, this situation wouldn't change. Even if Storm's End somehow managed to hold on to the Reach, there was the matter of the Tyrell family. The Tyrells were wealthier than the Baratheons, owning more land and having more soldiers. A vassal house wealthier and with more soldiers than the royal house was absolutely unacceptable. In such a country, who would take the king seriously? The Tyrell's word would dominate the country's governance, even more than the king's. In short, the Reach was an unnecessary investment right now, and even if successful, the returns were risky. Furthermore, Stannis was personally eager to witness the war where the Reach bubble would burst and the Tyrells would fight for survival. He still remembered how Mace Tyrell had held a grand feast in front of the starving garrison during the Storm's End siege, and now it was Stannis' turn to do the same. Stannis was not a vengeful man, but he would definitely do it with great pleasure. With great pleasure. And then, he would go to the temples of the old and new gods and thank them for their justice. "Brother," he said finally. Stannis had long since learned that, to be taken seriously by his king, Robert had to stop addressing him with royal formalities and begin speaking to him informally. "There's important news about the Stepstones." At this, the room fell silent. The war between the Triarchy and Dorne had become the main topic of the Three Kingdoms alliance lately. Dorne was losing the war, as expected. Under normal circumstances, the Stormlords wouldn't have cared what would happen to Dorne, but the situation with the Stepstones concerned Westeros trade security. Ships trading with the western shores of Westeros had to pass through there, and in addition, pirates who had settled on those islands were harming the trade relationships of Gulltown and White Harbor, both with Essos and with each other. After King's Landing had disappeared, Westeros' internal trade map had been crippled, and especially the Reach Lords were in a bad situation as they had lost their flow of gold. Despite everything, this was one of the main reasons they were preparing for war. Allowing the Stepstones to be taken would make an already bad commercial situation even worse, and it was something that couldn't be allowed. Yes, the Stepstones. Ned wrote to me that this matter was extremely important. "All right, let all the unnecessary bastards get out," Robert commanded. Stannis wanted to shout, "You're the king. Does Ned Stark have to tell you to pay attention to matters of the realm?" "What's the latest news?" the king asked after the room had emptied. "The Triarchy has taken Bloodstone after a long effort." "Fuck," Robert muttered. "If Bloodstone has fallen, it won't take long for the rest of the islands to fall as well. Those Dornish bastards deserve credit, they've fought well." Stannis nodded in agreement. His brother was many things, but he was never a bad warrior. There was no need to explain the importance of Bloodstone to him. "What do you think, Barristan?" Robert asked. "Your Majesty, personally speaking, I really can't forget Bloodstone," said the Stormguard Barristan Selmy. "Bloodstone is the heart of the Stepstones, and it's of critical importance to those who want to take the islands. Moreover, the island itself offers a natural defense against attacks from any direction. Even if there were only a small number of soldiers there, taking it would require accepting serious losses." Barristan shook his head. "During the war against the Black Fires, even though we had 3 to 4 times as many soldiers as the enemy, we still had to struggle for a long time to take Bloodstone, and we suffered many losses. Your grandfather, Ormond Baratheon, was among the casualties." The room fell silent. It was a well-known tragic story that during the War of the Nine Penny Kings, their grandfather Ormond Baratheon had died in his son Stefan's arms. The Baratheon ancestors had made many sacrifices for the Targaryens, but they had never been rewarded, and all their services ultimately returned as betrayal. "Well, if it were up to me, I would take the navy and attack immediately, but I swore I wouldn't start a war without Ned and Jon's approval," said King Robert. "The Driftmark meeting is in 3 months, right? We'll discuss this issue then. I'm sure they have a plan in mind." Driftmark, yes, had been chosen as the gathering point for the first of the royal meetings planned to take place every 5 years, at House Valerian's home. When Stannis first heard the news, he was shocked, like many other lords, but once he learned the reasoning behind the choice, it made sense. After the Greedoom disaster, the reputation of 3 houses in Westeros had been severely shaken: House Valerian, House Celtigar, and House Hightower. The Hightowers were privileged to be protected by the faith of the Seven, but Valerian and Celtigar had no such opportunity. The same situation did not apply to the Baratheons, whose grandmother was Targaryen. First of all, no one wanted to oppose a royal house. Secondly, despite the claim that their distant ancestor, Ois Baratheon, was the bastard brother of conqueror Aegon, the Baratheons had never asserted Valyrian heritage, and they had no Valyrian phenotypic traits either. The Baratheons, aside from their name, were entirely the continuation of the Durrandon legacy, and this was a widely accepted truth throughout Westeros. Well, the Celtigars were somewhat better off than the Valerius. After all, they had always been ignored by the Targaryens when it came to marriage matters. Every time, without exception, the Targaryens had chosen the Valerius. This issue had always been frustrating for the Celtigar family, but looking at it now, it seemed like a great blessing. The Celtigars had lost their Valyrian silver hair long ago and now looked more Andal than Valyrian. The growing anti-Valyrian movement was mainly composed of illiterate, uneducated peasants. These people distinguished the Valyrians only by their silver hair and purple eyes, with no knowledge of the noble house's history, except for the legends like the Starks. They didn't think the Celtigars were Valyrian because they looked Andal, but this advantage didn't mean they were free from all the problems. There were also noblemen and maesters who supported the anti-Valyrian movement, and they were well aware of the Celtigars' historical roots. The Valerius, however, did not have the same advantage as the Celtigars. They resembled the Targaryens entirely with their silver hair and purple eyes. The daughter of Lord Valerian had been brutally murdered in Highgarden because of this appearance. Westeros, their homeland for 1,000 years, had become a death trap for them. Many lords from the Stormlands were conspiring for the Valerius and Celtigars to suffer the same fate as the Targaryens, and the new lord of the Crownlands, Storm King Robert Baratheon, had no intention of protecting them. In short, these two houses were walking a fine line, and if things continued as they were, they would be exiled from their homeland. Aware of how critical the situation was, Lord Montfort Valerian and Lord Adrian Celtigar met and spent several days discussing how to escape their predicament. In the end, they decided to use their advantages. Despite being shunned by much of Westeros, the Valerius and Celtigars still possessed powerful fleets and a treasury filled to the brim. Lord Celtigar and Lord Valerian, accompanied by a large protective army, first visited the Eyrie and then Winterfell, where they personally met with King Jon Arryn and King Eddard Stark. For obvious reasons, they did not go to Storm's End. Their offer was not only very clever but also highly beneficial for both kings. They wanted the three kings' meeting to take place in Driftmark, and in return, they would cover all the costs of the meeting without compensation. Additionally, they would organize a grand tournament at their own expense. But that wasn't all. In exchange for reminding the other lords that the Valerius and Celtigars were loyal, Westerosi, and would never again serve the Targaryens, they would gift the Three Kingdoms Alliance fleet 50 warships. Furthermore, they pledged their full support in a forthcoming war at the Stepstones. Jon Arryn and Eddard Stark were already concerned about the economic harm caused by the growing anti-Valyrian movement, so they had no reason to reject such a proposal with such great advantages. Robert grumbled for a while, but when he heard about the great tournament, he agreed as well. The Valerius and Celtigars knew they would spend a lot of money on this meeting, but they would regain some of the prestige they had lost after the Greedoom. Once their loyalty was publicly affirmed by the three kings, the threat of exile from Westeros and the destruction of their houses would largely disappear. In short, everyone was pleased, except for some grumbling anti-Valyrian lords. Stannis, as the admiral of the Three Kings Alliance fleet and Lord of Dragonstone, had been frequently visiting Driftmark over the past year, patrolling the surrounding seas to ensure the safety of the waters. He arranged both protection and secure routes for lords and kings traveling to the region by ship, ensuring that the Three Kings meeting would take place without issue. Of course, the possibility of betrayal from the Valerius and Celtigars was not something Stannis was expecting, but if they tried something, even if they succeeded, it would mean their complete loss of power in Westeros. Nevertheless, Stannis' tight control was reassuring to many lords worried about their safety, and the Valerius, wanting as many lords to attend as possible, had no problems with the situation. The meeting would take place in 3 months. The fleet, led by Stannis, would first pick up King Eddard from White Harbor and then King Jon Arryn from Gulltown. Both kings would be protected by nearly 100 ships. Since the distance between Storm's End and Driftmark was not very far, Robert would also travel by sea. The three kings' meeting was not just about the kings, many lords would also be present, and representatives from other kingdoms would be sent as well. Oberyn Martell would attend in person to represent Dorne. Robert was especially excited because he would be bringing his one-year-old twin children, Argilac and Argella, to the meeting. The children would meet Robb Stark and Illyria Snow. Sansa Stark was too young to travel. Robert was very eager to arrange a marriage between his daughter and Robb Stark. In short, it was a meeting that offered many opportunities to form trade and marriage alliances. Driftmark would become the heart of politics and economics in Westeros for the entire month of the meeting. Stannis knew that Jon Arryn and Eddard Stark were planning something for the Stepstones campaign. He also knew that a very important guest from Teosh would be present at the meeting. It had been nearly 5 years since the war, and although the wounds had mostly healed, the issue of troop numbers was still problematic. The majority of the Stormlands army had been lost during the Trident campaign, and even now, they could barely muster 20,000 soldiers. Stannis let out a deep sigh, knowing that the coming months would be busy and exhausting. Robert often said that, in such times, it was the duty of a wife to help her husband. Stannis didn't know what his brother meant by that, but perhaps it was indeed time to take a wife. Notes. In this chapter, I wrote about how 3 houses in Westeros faced a significant decline in reputation after the Greedoom catastrophe. The Valerius and Celtigars have obvious reasons, after all, they are of Valyrian descent. But the Hightowers? I can almost hear you asking. I'll explain this in the upcoming chapters, but I want to give readers a chance to speculate. I know some of you are particularly observant, and I believe you won't have much trouble figuring out the reasons. Robb Stark and Jon Snow are 4 years old. Illyria Snow is 5 years old. Sansa Stark is 2 years old. Argilac and Argella Baratheon, the twins, are 1 year old. Chapter 9, Jon Arryn. Notes. Robert's Rebellion 283 AC. Maidenpool Council 284 AC. The Driftmark Meeting, 288 AC. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. It is said that with his dying breath, the old falcon called out for his children. But the names that left his lips were not those of young Jasper Arryn or his stillborn daughters, they were Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon. Paul Mertens, Dean of History, Eddard University. Old Falcon lovingly embraced the 4 small children. Jon had no hope of seeing a grandchild before his death. In fact, he had even doubted he would have a child at all. Yet the presence of these 4 little ones was a great comfort. They were the Vale King's grandchildren in every way except by blood. Little Robb was a Stark bearing the Tully colours. Argilac was loud and strong even at just 1 year old. Argella was like her father's daughter in every way, yet still beautiful, and Illyria. If his late friend Rickard Stark were still alive, Jon had no doubt Rickard would have doted on her. Jon was certain of that. Little Illyria's mother's fate was tragic, and for a child to grow up without a mother was equally heartbreaking. The girl was a bastard, her surname was Snow, yet she was treated no differently than a Stark princess. Ned adored his daughter, and little Robb had already become his sister's little wolf, trailing after her wherever she went. It was quite an amusing sight. Jon wondered why Eddard hadn't legitimized his eldest daughter, but there could be countless reasons. Perhaps he was simply waiting for the right time. It wasn't Jon's place to question it. Besides his 4 grandchildren, there were 2 more uninvited children present, Margaery and Loras Tyrell. Jon Arryn had begun to think Mace Tyrell had lost his mind. With the Reach on the brink of explosion, abandoning his kingdom could only be seen as foolishness. If the Reach rebellion broke out while they were away, other lords might seize the opportunity to invade Highgarden in the Paramount Lord's absence. Don't bother wasting words, I know exactly what you're thinking. You're calling us fools. Jon Arryn didn't even need to turn around to see who was speaking. Throughout Westeros, there was only one woman who would speak to the King of the Vale like that despite having no close ties to him, Olenna Tyrell. The Queen of Thorns. Jon Arryn didn't mince his words. Why are you here when a rebellion is about to break out in your own home? To secure a few things before it all starts, Olenna said with a sad look at her granddaughter. May I speak with you privately? I think your son should be included in this conversation as well. My son is busy right now, praising your northern king about how beautiful a wife Margaery would be for Robb. Foolish nonsense. Olenna shook her head. I told him arranging a marriage was impossible, but men are fools. Old Falcon sighed at the comment. After leaving the children at the nursery, he followed Lady Olenna to an empty room. I hope this conversation isn't a waste of my time. As King of the Vale, my time is limited, and I've already sacrificed time with my grandchildren for you. He wanted to say, this will be the greatest concession I make to the Reach, but decided to hold his tongue. Her words were too sharp, she would likely find a way to twist that statement back into Jon's mouth. It's obvious you see those children as your grandchildren. What would you do for them? Lady Olenna went straight to the point. It was an odd question. Jon had only just met the children, yet he couldn't deny he already felt like a fresh new grandfather. So, he spoke honestly. I can't think of anything I wouldn't do for them. At least for now. We share common feelings. My King of the Vale. Olenna suddenly made a shocking move, kneeling before Jon Arryn with great respect. The future of my house is complex and uncertain, King Arryn, which is why I beg of you. The old woman bowed until her forehead touched the ground. Please take my grandchildren with you and keep them safe. I ask for nothing else, only to know that they are in a secure place during the civil war. If you accept, House Tyrell will never forget this favor. Jon stared in astonishment at the woman kneeling before him. The once proud Queen of Thorns was now begging him, humbled and desperate. If the old woman thought that after begging like this for her grandchildren, Old Falcon would not be able to refuse, she was absolutely right. Please, rise, Lady Olenna, he said hurriedly. I cannot speak on behalf of the three kingdoms alone, but I swear to you I will keep your grandchildren safe. If necessary, I will raise them in the Eyrie. Hearing this, Lady Olenna immediately stood up, returning to her former noble and proud posture as if she had never knelt. Yet, there was gratitude in her eyes. At that moment, a servant entered the room. After looking around in surprise, he hurriedly bowed. Ah, King Arryn. The other guests are looking for you, you are expected in the feast hall. Jon Arryn nodded in acknowledgement and extended his arm to Lady Olenna as an escort. The two of them silently walked down the corridor and ascended to the feast hall. There were only a few people in the hall. It was a small family gathering. Mace Tyrell, Robert, and Eddard were discussing something. Benjen and Stannis appeared to be getting along well, while Queen Catelyn was engaged in conversation with Queen Alea. Jon, unfortunately, could not bring Lysa. The Vale Queen had miscarried twice in the last 4 years, and now she was pregnant with their third child. Her health wasn't fit to attend this meeting, and even if it were, Jon would not have brought her. She would have certainly disrupted the whole family atmosphere. Old Falcon cleared his throat a few times to announce his arrival and gave Lady Olenna a meaningful look. This gathering was only for family, and they were not invited. The Queen of Thorns understood immediately and left the hall with her son. What did you talk about with the old woman? Robert asked curiously as soon as they were alone. She wants her grandchildren to remain under our guardianship, so they can stay away from the war. Did you accept? Eddard asked. I accepted on my own behalf. If neither of you wants the children, I will take them to the Eyrie, but personally, I don't want that. I'm an old man now, and looking after children is tiring work. He looked at Eddard and Robert with a knowing glance. Ahem. If you like, I can take the children. I already have 4 in Winterfell, and if I take 2 more. With the other children Catelyn and I plan to have, Winterfell will turn into a nursery. I'll take them, no problem, Robert said. They'll be good friends for Argilac and Argella. Plus, after the chaos in the Reach ends, we can use the children as an excuse to expand our influence in the Reach. Jon Arryn nodded approvingly at the idea. Contrary to what many believed, Robert wasn't ignorant when it came to politics and intrigue, he was just lazy. For the management of the Three Kingdoms alliance, Jon and Eddard were trustworthy. For the governance of his country, Robert's grandfather, Eldon Estermont, was reliable, and for the management of his army, Robert trusted his brother Stannis. According to him, these individuals would do a much better job than he ever could, so there was no need to unnecessarily interfere or throw obstacles in their way. Well, at least that was the excuse he used for his laziness. How is your relationship with Queen Alea? Eddard asked. At this question, Robert's face turned red, as if ashamed of himself. She almost died while giving birth to Argilac and Argella, and they said she couldn't have any more children. Yet, she gave me a strong son and a beautiful daughter, and she never complained. The 7 No, I'm not a good husband to her, Ned, but I swear I'm trying to improve. Does that mean you've stopped sleeping with whores and drinking? Ned asked skeptically. Well, not exactly, Robert admitted. I've reduced both, and I don't look at women in public places anymore. I can't disrespect a layer like that. I only sneak whores in some nights, but recently, I've been spending more time with my wife than with whores. If I can get her to be a little more adventurous in bed, our relationship will have no deficiencies. John was pleased to see Robert's life improving. Robert wasn't a bad person, he was just a passionate man who lived life at full tilt, often led by his emotions. King Arryn, King Stark, Brother Stannis suddenly entered the conversation with Benjen. Since all of you are here, I'd like to hear your plans regarding the Stepstone battle, as the commander of the Three Kingdoms Alliance Navy. Stannis, this is a family meeting, Robert said, his irritation evident. It doesn't matter. You'll all know soon anyway, and it's better that Stannis learns about it first. As the fleet commander John waved his hand dismissively. We were making some adjustments for the war, Robert. I'm sorry we didn't tell you earlier, but we needed to be sure of the plan's viability first. So, what's the plan? Robert asked, his curiosity piqued. We're helping Dawn, but we won't bring them into the Three Kingdoms Alliance, Ned explained. We'll be sending 30,000 soldiers to Stepstone. 30,000 soldiers. Robert stared in shock. Allocating that many resources will be a huge cost, and even if we send them, winning the war isn't guaranteed. How many soldiers should the Stormlands contribute? You know, militarily, we're in a bit of a tight spot. Let me explain. Ned raised his hand. The Stormlands will contribute around 3,000 soldiers, but we're expecting them to be the best we can get. And no, you're definitely not coming, don't even bring it up. The Vale suffered serious losses in the rebellion, but they'll contribute 5,000 soldiers. The remaining 12,000 will be provided by the North. There seems to be a mistake in your calculations, Stannis pointed out. That adds up to 20,000 soldiers, not 30,000. John and Ned exchanged uncertain glances. Hearing this would not be good news for them. Do you remember the envoy we brought from Tiosh? Yes, but I don't know who he is. You're keeping his identity like a state secret. Because it's a state secret, Robert. John Arryn sighed. The person we brought is Harry Strickland. Harry Strickland. Robert paused, trying to recall the name. The commander of the Golden Company. That son of a bitch, Black Firlic Spittle, what's he doing in my kingdom? Shut your mouth. Eddard gave Robert a punch on the shoulder, making sure no outsider saw. We're still trying to keep his identity a secret. If the Triarchy finds out Strickland is here, our plans will fall apart. The Golden Company. You can't be serious. Stannis seemed unfazed by his brother getting punched. My grandfather died fighting them. He gestured to Ned. Our fathers fought against them. Jon Arryn looked at him. You fought against them, King Arryn. I fought against them, so I know the Golden Company, Jon Arryn explained. Even when they served Maelys Blackfyr, they were honorable men who stayed true to their knightly oaths. I fought them, but I never hated them. And do I need to remind you that the last Blackfyr is already dead? What are they offering us? Robert cut straight to the point. A professional army of 10,000 men. The best mercenary company in Essos, and they're experienced in fighting on the Stepstones. They'll ensure we can take back Bloodstone immediately. Strategically, that's impossible, Stannis expressed his thoughts. Bloodstone isn't an island we can just take easily. He paused and looked at Jon Arryn and Eddard Stark. Ha! You're going to sign a deal with the Triarchy and betray them, aren't you? There's no other way to take Bloodstone back quickly. Jon and Eddard remained silent. Stannis had hit the nail on the head, leaving them with nothing to say. Gods damn it, Jon. Robert sighed. You just said they were honorable men. I admit the method is a bit unpleasant, Old Falcon said. But it's been 5 years since the rebellion. We're still struggling with money and troops. We can't afford to fight a long war. If we're short on money, how will we pay them? Stannis asked. Even the Lannisters would have trouble paying the Golden Company's fees, and we all know their motto, our word is good as gold. Ned explained, you're aware of the anti-Valyrian ideology spreading in Westeros. Robert and Stannis nodded in agreement. The same thing is happening in Essos right now, especially in cities with Valyrian origins, where anti-Westerosi ideology is spreading, and the Golden Company, a company of Westerosi origin, is affected by this. However, their betrayal of the Triarchy is not the only reason for it. What is it then? Robert asked, curious. Westeros wants to return, Robert. They were exiled from their homeland long ago, and their desire to return has never ceased. This is the payment we'll make. As the Three Kingdoms Alliance, we will grant lordships and lands to the nobles of the Golden Company. Harry Strickland came to Driftmark to negotiate the details. Damn it, Ned. Robert sighed. Isn't there another option? Even if we don't give them the lands they want, they can take them themselves, Jon Arryn explained. They could use the civil war in the Reach to make the same deal with the Tyrells. While we have the chance, it's better for us to make the deal now. We're still recovering, and we can't risk a long war or a severed trade relationship with Essos. Don't worry, Robert, we'll place them in scattered locations. Some will even get lands in New Gift, and we'll make sure they are far enough apart to keep an eye on their loyalties, Ned assured. Even if they plan a rebellion, they won't be able to coordinate with each other. All right, I trust you, Robert said. But House Tywin stays away from my lands. They are definitely not coming back to the Stormlands. What do you think, Stannis? Jon looked to the fleet commander. The plan is viable, Stannis agreed. I'll need to negotiate the attack details with Strickland, but I can guarantee you the Golden Company's nobles won't be well received in Westeros, and this plan will have long-term consequences. Tell me something I don't know, Old Falcon sighed. The door creaked open slightly, and a servant's voice broke the silence as they leaned in. Dinner is ready, my lord, they said in a soft tone. The tension in the room broke for a moment as everyone stood up with a quiet acceptance. The air was filled with the delicious scent of steaming food. Roasted meats, freshly baked bread, and an abundance of vegetable dishes were arranged in the center of the table. Wine glasses were raised, and the sound of children's joyful laughter echoed through the room. Robert and Ned whispered to each other at the head of the table, nudging each other with their elbows, while Illyria tore pieces of bread with her small fingers to feed Argilac and Argella. Queen Alea and Catelyn were attempting to calm the children, and Jon watched the lively scene with a smile, enjoying the warmth it brought. In that moment, Jon distanced himself from everything, lost in the joy of the meal, and his heart filled with peace. Notes. Some might argue that I am portraying Robert in too positive a light in this chapter, but keep in mind that this is a Jon Arryn POV, so I am not sharing my personal thoughts. Chapter 10, Kevan 2. Chapter text. When the decisions of the Driftmark meeting were announced, the young Lion King saw the opportunity he had long been waiting for. This decision of his would bring disaster to the Westerlands and mark the beginning of a tale of heroism and tragedy that would be told for many years to come. From Greedom and after, the wolves marched to power by Maester Vat. Are they really going to attack Stepstone with only 20,000 soldiers? Jaime raised his eyebrows as he read the letter in his hand. It seems toppling the Targaryens has made them a bit too arrogant. What do you think, uncle? Kevan couldn't deny his surprise at the news. Having fought alongside his brother Tywin in the War of the Ninepenny Kings, he knew how challenging a battlefield Stepstone could be. Especially Bloodstone, it hadn't earned its name for nothing. If the Three Kingdoms Alliance were still holding that island, 20,000 soldiers would have been a reasonable number. However, Kevan knew that the island had been taken by the Triarchy and was now heavily fortified. The Valyrian cities had opened their purses this time, hiring the best sellsword company in Essos, the Golden Company, to defend Bloodstone. Those bastards were hardened warriors, carrying the legacy of bitter steel, and they lived up to that legacy to the fullest. Kevan had experienced it firsthand. I'm not sure, he said after a moment's thought. Robert Baratheon may be a drunkard, but he's never a fool when it comes to war. During the rebellion, he crushed 3 loyalist armies in a single day. Ned Stark struck the Targaryen forces from behind at Stony September and planned the victory at the Trident. Even if those two have grown complacent, Jonarin is a cautious man and a veteran of the War of the Ninepenny Kings. He knows Stepstone, he would never underestimate it. He tapped his fingers on the table. There's something odd about this, nephew. It's definitely not as simple as it seems. If you say so, Jaime murmured to himself. The Three Kingdoms Alliance is at war with the Triarchy, and the Reach Rebellion is only a few months away at most. The time has come. The time for what? Kevan dreaded the answer he was about to hear. Marriage, Jaime said, short and firm. Kevan didn't know what to say at that moment. Yes, to be honest, it was something he had both expected and feared in his nightmares. When Kevan first discovered Jaime and Cersei, he thought he'd lost his mind. He tried every method possible to separate them, and eventually, Jaime's response had been to threaten him with being stripped of his rank. At the time, the people of Lannisport knew there had been an argument between Kevan and Jaime, but they were unaware of the reason. Kevan would never allow such an act, one that would stain his house's name forever, to be exposed. The Golden Lion tried to advise his nephew, explaining the disasters that would follow if such a thing became known. The Seven's Council, which had grown far more conservative after Greedoom, would never allow it. They would immediately issue a decree cursing House Lannister. That decree would shake the loyalty of the Westerlands people to their rulers and the Western Lords. A significant portion of them would likely begin preparing for rebellion, refusing to obey a king who showed Targaryen-like tendencies. Even the houses that chose to remain loyal would likely distance themselves from the Lannisters. And what about the Ironborn? Balon Greyjoy had proven himself to be a remarkably patient man by not acting yet, but Kevan knew the Ironborn had been building warships for the past 5 years. If the Westerlands plunged into chaos, they would undoubtedly seize the opportunity. Of course, Cersei never listened. Jaime seemed a bit more flexible, yet he still refused to part from his sister. Uncle, he had told Kevan, lions do not answer to lambs. The faith of the Seven are not lambs, Kraken's are not lambs, and neither are our bannermen. Upon hearing this answer, Kevan sighed and began to consider other options. What would Tywin do? He asked himself that question once again, and deep down, he already knew the answer. If Tywin were here, he would kill Cersei, and Kevan could do the same. Perhaps he should. But making Cersei's death look like an accident would be difficult. Jaime would immediately suspect his uncle. Kevan knew how stubbornly Jaime ignored all reason, how fiercely passionate he was about Cersei. What would he do to avenge the woman he loved? He would kill Kevan without hesitation. But that wasn't the real concern. Kevan was a soldier by birth, he wasn't afraid of dying. However, if anything happened to his wife Dorna or his children, that was something he couldn't bear. Would Jaime punish them too? Kevan didn't know, and he wasn't willing to gamble. Besides, even if Cersei were dead, the shadow looming over House Lannister wouldn't disappear. People would start asking questions. First, how Jaime was so certain of his uncle's guilt. Second, why Kevan would kill Cersei. Eventually, the matter would be investigated, and their secret would likely be revealed. In short, Cersei's death wouldn't solve anything. And what about killing Jaime? Kevan pushed aside all personal feelings and seriously considered it. Arranging an assassination and making it look like an accident would not be easy. Even if Kevan managed to pull it off, Tyrion would be crowned as the new king. The Western Lords taking an ugly dwarf seriously as their king seemed unlikely. House Lannister's reputation and influence over the Westerlands would be severely damaged once again. Kevan found himself in an incredibly helpless situation. Every plan he considered would either harm House Lannister's reputation or weaken its power. So he chose the only option that had a chance of getting through this safely. He convinced Jaime to keep the relationship secret at all costs and waited for him to grow bored and abandon Cersei. During those years, Kevan didn't hesitate to try different methods. He frequently brought noble or low-born girls before Jaime, or sometimes snuck women he thought would suit Jaime's tastes into his chambers at night. Kevan was willing to accept his nephew becoming a man like Robert Baratheon if that meant he would leave Cersei behind. At first, the plan seemed to work. Jaime had slept with one of the whores who visited his room one evening, but later it turned out he had called her Cersei in bed. In short, Kevan had to clean up another mess. Eventually, Cersei realized what Kevan was trying to do, and she found her own ways to interfere, by having some of those approaching Jaime, both whores and noble ladies alike, killed. Thus, the years following the Maidenpool Council went by in this manner. Kevan had managed to keep their relationship hidden, but that was all he had accomplished. Nephew, please think again. There are other solutions. Kevan tried reasoning with Jaime. Cersei is pregnant. She can drink moon tea. Kevan's voice was almost pleading. She's drunk too much moon tea in recent years, and she did it only because you insisted on keeping our relationship a secret, Jaime explained. If she drinks more, it could harm her womb and affect her fertility. Kevan took a deep breath and looked at Jaime's face in the dim light of the room. There was that familiar, stubborn expression on his face, the ease of a man who thought he had won the argument. This is madness, Kevan repeated, his voice shaking. Jaime, no one must know Cersei is pregnant. We must find a way. A way to do what, uncle? Jaime cut him off. Are we going to kill the baby? Send Cersei into exile? Both. Who's going to do it, you? When Kevan saw the determination in Jaime's eyes, a deep fear gripped him. You must give up on this, Jaime, he said, his voice trembling and tense. I won't give up, Jaime replied, his voice as hard as steel. I will marry Cersei, and the child we have will be my heir. Kevan's face turned as pale as chalk. He whispered. Jaime, do you know what you're doing? This puts not just House Lannister, but all of Westerlands in danger. I am the king, Jaime replied harshly. This is my right. Cersei is the woman I love, and our child is my heir. As king, I've made my decision. The faith of the Seven will never allow it, Kevan warned. After Greedoom, the Seven's council won't stand for such things. They'll curse you, turn the people away from you. I won't let them, Jaime said. I've gained the support of our bannermen, the people of Westerland trust me. After executing false knights like Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorque, they turned to me. They call me Young Lion King. I've done my duty as a king, and everyone knows it. That's not enough, Kevan pressed. Most of our bannermen are conservative men. They've seen the Targaryens fall because of incest. When word gets out about your marriage to Cersei, they'll feel that same fear, and the Ironborn will take advantage of the chaos and start raiding our coasts. I'm not a Targaryen, Jaime said coldly. I'm a Lannister. I carry the blood of the lion, and my people know it. Besides, we've been preparing for the Ironborn invasion since the Maidenpool Council. Jaime, Kevan said, his voice almost pleading. You're taking this too lightly. If this marriage happens, think about what will happen to the Westerlands. Enough, Jaime interrupted sharply. I've made my decision, uncle. I will marry Cersei, and the child we have will be the heir to the rock. No one will make me change my mind. Kevan took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He felt the weight in his chest spreading through his entire body. He had spent years trying to solve this issue, with logic, threats, and even secret schemes. But in the end, it was all for nothing. When he opened his eyes, his expression had hardened. He knew there was no point in trying to convince Jaime anymore. He wouldn't be able to stop him, but there were other things he could do to protect the Westerlands. So be it, Kevan said, his voice hoarse and tired. But don't be so sure that we'll see the day that child is born. If the Ironborn come knocking at our door, or if our bannermen rise up, it will be your responsibility. Jaime nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Don't worry, uncle, he said confidently. Everything will be fine. As Kevan looked at Jaime's arrogant demeanor, he thought to himself, Gods help us. He left the room and entered his personal office. Sitting at his desk, he took his pen and began writing letters to the most powerful bannermen of the Westerlands. If Jaime's madness would set Westerlands on fire. Forgive me, Tywin, but as you once said, nothing is more important than the Lannister legacy. Chapter 11, Golden Lion, Golden Kraken, Golden Rose and an Old Falcon. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Banners gleamed in hues of gold. 3 crests adorned with pride so bold. The lion's roar, the kraken's cry. And the rose that fears not death. Luthen of Bane fought. Fuck, Kevan groaned in pain as he clutched the arrow wound on his shoulder. He hadn't expected things to unfold this way. After learning of his nephew's unwavering determination, Kevan had written letters to the most important lords of the Westerlands to send later. That same night, he had spoken with his siblings and explained the inevitable situation to them. Jenna didn't react because she already knew. In fact, she had helped Kevan when he tried to separate Jaime and Cersei. Most of the ideas Kevan had implemented had originally come from her. Geryon had cursed Jaime furiously, thrown his wine glass at the wall, and drank heavily. Tijet, as always, remained calm, sitting quietly in the corner and starting to make plans. That day, the four siblings made a decision: Kevan would become the new king, and Jaime would die before he could drag the Westerlands into inevitable doom. Cersei would be sent to the Silent Sisters after giving birth. The child would be hidden as Geryon's bastard. Since Geryon already had a bastard, no one would be too surprised to hear of a second one. Jenna argued that the child, being an incest-born bastard, should be killed, but Kevan strongly opposed this. The sins of the parents should not be cast upon the child. Tyrion, unfortunately, couldn't rule. Being a dwarf, he would never be taken seriously by their bannermen. However, they could send him to Old Town for maester training. His nephew already had an inclination and interest in such a profession. Jaime was a beloved king among the people and nobles, and he was also quite healthy. Making his assassination look like an accident would be both risky and extremely difficult. Even if they succeeded, many would still suspect foul play. Moreover, if Jaime was killed openly, Kevan's rise to power would undoubtedly be seen as usurpation. After lengthy discussions, they decided to reveal Jaime and Cersei's secret, without exposing the child's existence. If all four of Tywin Lannister's siblings revealed the same truth, the Westerland lords and people would believe them. This way, Kevan's claim to the throne would gain legitimacy, and any risk of civil war would be averted. The idea of becoming king by committing kinslaying troubled Kevan, but he was certain the High Septon would understand the situation once it was explained. With a little donation, he would surely issue a decree proclaiming Kevan's sins absolved. These measures would solve most potential problems. A swift and painless death was planned for Jaime, a knife to the throat while he slept, and it would be over quickly. At least, that's what Kevan told himself to feel better. Tijet was already the commander of Casterly Rock's garrison, so placing soldiers loyal to Kevan around the king's chambers wouldn't be a problem. What Kevan hadn't anticipated was Tijet's betrayal, and yet, he shouldn't have been surprised. In fact, he should have seen it coming. Tijet had always been a soldier at heart, not just in skill with a sword, but in personality as well. His loyalty to Tywin was unwavering and unquestionable. He followed orders and carried them out. To him, Jaime was king and his leader. Of course, as a soldier, Tijet would follow his king. Damn fool. Kevan almost wanted to laugh at the irony of it all. Tijet was never one for intrigue or these sorts of matters. Yet by participating so actively in their plans, he had, for once in his life, done exactly that. And in doing so, he had completely ruined his older brother Kevan, in a single stroke. Perhaps Kevan should congratulate him. After the betrayal, Kevan and Geryon had escaped Casterly Rock using some secret tunnels known only to family members. However, the escape hadn't been easy. Kevan had been shot in the shoulder, and poor Jenna had died. Kevan wanted to curse and scream, but he didn't even have the time to mourn his sister. At least I had sent my wife Dorna and our children to safety long before this, Kevan consoled himself. Yes, he had an expected betrayal, but he had considered the possibility of failure and prepared an escape plan accordingly. Now, Kevan and Geryon were on horseback, using the mountain passes they knew well to reach the Golden Tooth. Lord Leo Lefford was a good friend of Kevan's, and he was confident Leo would support him. Kevan planned to explain the situation to the Westerland lords there and then formally declare himself king. Kevan's relationship with the other Westerland lords was strong, even those who didn't like him respected him. He was sure he could secure the loyalty of more than half the bannermen. Kevan prayed to the old gods and the new, asking for mercy for himself and for the Westerlands, though he didn't expect them to listen. Kevan knew this matter would end in great loss for both the Westerlands and House Lannister. There was nothing he could do but sigh deeply and prepare for what was to come. "The time has come," Balon Greyjoy announced. Victorian gave a slight nod. Yes, the time had definitely come. The Ironborn had waited and prepared far too long for this famous raid, yet it was clear that the wait hadn't been in vain. Jaime Lannister had gotten his own sister pregnant and married her. What kind of freak fucks his own sister? Victorian thought with a laugh. The Lannisters had always been arrogant bastards who thought themselves better than everyone else, and now their inflated egos seemed to have led them straight to incest. Prepare the fleet, we'll raid Lannisport, Cricket Hall, Fair Castle, and Seaguard. Balon continued. Victorian cursed under his breath. We can't raid Seaguard, brother. If we do that, we'll be biting off more than we can chew. We'll have the entire Three Kings Alliance against us. That alliance's fleet is fighting at the Stepstones right now. They can't deal with us. By the time they return, we'll have plundered the north and the Riverlands. Don't be stupid, brother. On Pike, there was only one man who could speak so bluntly to his own king, Euron, of course. The northern bastards are as poor as we are, and the Riverlands, well, I can't deny it's tempting, but it's no feast like the Westerlands or the Reach. Besides, our resources aren't endless. We can't sack every western coast in Westeros without getting rich enough first. Fine, then Balon Greyjoy said with a dismissive wave of his hand. If Euron and Victorian, two brothers who despised each other, were agreeing on something, Balon couldn't afford to be stubborn. Once the Reach and the Westerlands have filled our coffers, we'll turn there. We'll invade the Riverlands all the way to Harrenhal and reclaim the legacy of Harren the Black. Euron and Victorian laughed at that. Neither of them gave a damn about Harren the Black's so-called legacy, but no Ironborn would ever say no to a good raid. I hereby declare before all the lords, the High Septon announced. From House Tyrell, Mace, first of his name, King of the Reach. Olenna sipped her wine with satisfaction as she watched her son crown himself. Just a few months ago, the lords of the Reach had been preparing to plunder each other's castles, yet now they were acting like old friends, their swords turned toward a much more prosperous prey. Fate seemed to have smiled on House Tyrell once again. Olenna made a mental note to visit the September soon and offer her thanks to the Seven, and she also had to visit the Godswood in the castle's gardens. After all, the old gods could have had a hand in the Reach's incredible fortune. The reasons for the civil war brewing in the Reach were simple. After King's Landing was destroyed, the Reach lords lost their livelihoods. They knew they would fall into poverty in the coming years, and the only way to avoid that was to acquire more land, more wealth, and more castles. There were already too many houses in the Reach, and thinning their numbers would only be advantageous. Olenna had thought through every possible plan to prevent war. Declaring Mace King wouldn't stop it, on the contrary, it would likely trigger it. The Reach lords were proud men, and after 3 centuries of effort, they had reluctantly accepted the Tyrells as their lord paramount. But what about becoming king? That was an entirely different story. The great houses of the Reach, though they claimed Andal descent, were originally of First Men blood, with histories stretching back thousands of years. Most were descended from Garth Gardener or his daughters. Such ancient houses were, of course, proud, and a house descended from a steward like the Tyrells would never be looked upon favorably. It had already been difficult enough for the Tyrells to establish themselves as Lord Paramount. Convincing them to accept the Tyrells as kings was downright impossible. Before they could ever be accepted as kings by the other great Reach houses, the Tyrells would need to win many battles and shed much blood, and even then, it would be far from certain. Olenna knew many Reach lords looked upon Highgarden with pride, but they saw it as a place of feasts and luxury, not a throne. Declaring the Hightower's kings was considered as an option, since they were a highly respected family in the Reach. Their history was so ancient that it even challenged that of the Starks. If they were crowned, the damage of a civil war could be minimized. But it quickly became clear that this was an impractical plan. The reason was simple: Greedoom. Just before Greedoom occurred, the last bit of information received about King's Landing came from a soldier of House Locke. According to the soldier, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Drold Hightower, had died while protecting his king. The honor of dying while protecting Aes the Wicked aside, many people claimed that Drold Hightower had been present when the order for Greedoom was given but had done nothing to stop it, even continuing to protect his king. Of course, there was no evidence to back this up, but many believed the story. This story had greatly damaged the reputation of House Hightower. The common folk, who often compared them to the Targaryens due to their similar genetic hair colors, had only added fuel to the fire. Had House Hightower not been aggressively protected by the Seventh Faith and the new High Septon, they would undoubtedly have faced some form of retaliation. The family was safe for the time being, but the fact that they had lost so much prestige remained undeniable. They had begun the process of rebuilding their damaged reputation by generously spending their gold on helping the poor and making constant charitable donations. However, it was still unlikely that House Hightower could declare itself as king in its current state, and it remained doubtful whether they could prevent a civil war. Making one of the other great houses of the Reach king wouldn't have prevented the inevitable war either. In short, the lords of the Reach had retreated to their homes. They were making alliances and scheming, while still sharpening their swords. Once those swords were drawn, the Reach would be turned into a bloodbath. Olenna was desperate. All she could do was delay the inevitable and secure her grandchildren's future by entrusting them to the Three Kingdoms alliance. During the meeting in Driftmark, she had tried one last attempt to convince Eddard Stark. She had suggested that if a marriage between Robb and Margaery were to take place, the Reach might join the Kingdom of the North. However, the Stark King's resolve was unshakable. "Don't misunderstand me, my lady," he had said to Olenna. But the only kingdoms that didn't suffer military losses or have their lands burned during the rebellion were Westerland and the Reach. I think it would be most appropriate for you to settle this outstanding debt while we rest. A civil war in the Reach seemed unavoidable, and the only thing the Tyrells could do was prepare for it with all their might. The bomb was only a few months away from exploding, until the news from Westerland arrived, about the civil war there and Jaime Lannister's disgusting incestuous affair with his sister. As soon as Olenna learned of the events, she seized the opportunity and acted swiftly. She presented the Reach lords with a far more profitable, higher chance of success, and more honorable option, to attack Westerland. Westerland was already divided between Jaime and Kevan Lannister. The Greyjoys had already begun raiding the ports. The country was in a weakened state, and on top of that, the Westerland lords were extremely wealthy from their gold and silver mines, the kind of wealth that Reach lords had their eyes on. The King of the Rock had committed the heinous act of marrying his own sister, and thus the High Septon had granted his full approval and blessing for a campaign against Westerland. There would be no moral dilemma in this war. They were not going to plunder Westerland but to rid it of the sinful incestuous king. Olenna took a sip of her wine, savoring it, and silently thanked Jaime Lannister for his stupidity. The Reach lords eagerly seized the opportunity to gain Westerland's gold, and the swords they had sharpened for each other were now aimed at Westerland. Mace used this opportunity to declare himself king and, at least for a time, won the loyalty of his bannermen. The gold and loot from Westerland would sustain the Reach for about 5 to 10 years, averting a potential civil war. Olenna intended to use this opportunity to strengthen House Tyrell's position as the ruling house. Around 80,000 soldiers had been mustered, with 20,000 remaining to guard the Reach's coasts, and the remaining 60,000 would be used to conquer Westerland. The divided Kingdom of the Rock was not expected to win this war. "Well, it's better that we do it instead of the Ironborn," Olenna thought, swirling her wine in her hand. "I wish I could see Tywin Lannister's face as he watches the fall of his legacy and his house." Jon Arryn sighed deeply as he read the latest reports. Jaime Lannister's incestuous madness, the Greyjoys raiding the Westerland coasts, and now the Reach taking advantage of the situation and, with the High Septon's approval, attacking the Rock. If there was one thing Jon was certain of, it was that the Lannisters' time had come. Lately, Jon had begun to fear the Reach growing too powerful. Steps would need to be taken to counter this, but as long as the Ironborn didn't attack the north, there was no intention to intervene. After all, the primary reason the Three Kingdoms alliance had been formed was so that, while other kingdoms were being cut off and raided, they could stay at peace and grow stronger. Jon's main focus now was the Stepstone campaign. He had trusted Stannis Baratheon on this matter, and he was largely confident they would succeed. The plans had been solid. However, there was one issue. Robert, for reasons unknown, had sent 10,000 additional troops to the Stepstones. Jon didn't understand the reasoning. If their plans to capture the islands failed, 10,000 extra men wouldn't make a difference. The Stormlands had wasted resources. But then again, Robert was the king of his own lands, and how he chose to govern was his prerogative. Jon, as a lord of another kingdom, could not interfere too much. Your Majesties, there's news from the Stepstones. John saw Nestor Royce, who had been appointed as the new hand of the king in place of his brother, entering the room. His face was ashen, pale. It was clear he had read the letter before bringing it. Is it bad news, Nestor? John asked cautiously. Well, it's not exactly what you thought, Your Majesty, Nestor stammered. But what you've read, you won't like it. John sighed deeply. Ever since he'd learned that his wife had given birth to a healthy son, Jasper, as they named him, his spirits had been high. Moreover, during a one-month meeting, 90% of the proceeds from the harvest were agreed to be given to the Three Kingdoms Alliance as part of their deal with the Valerius. This meant the alliance had gained a good amount of gold, further elevating John's mood. But now, it seemed the cost of a few months' happiness was about to be paid. Please, let it not be as bad as I think, John prayed as he took the letter and read it carefully. He read it once, then again, and again. He felt the need to verify the authenticity of Stannis Baratheon's seal a few times before finally looking up at Nestor Royce. What the hell is this? Notes. I have confirmed the House Hightower matter in this chapter, and I would like to especially congratulate some of the readers who correctly predicted it. Chapter 12, Stannis 2. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. The 290 AC Stepstones campaign created a rift between Westeros and Essos that would not heal for several hundred years, sowing the seeds of hatred that would later incite many wars. As the leader of Westeros, I have come here to apologize for the actions of our ancestors. The seeds of hatred between the Westerosi and Valyrian peoples were sown here, and the seeds of peace will be sown here as well. Alduin Ackerman, High President of the Westeros Federation. Stannis cursed inwardly. How had things come to this? Their actions here would undoubtedly have severe consequences. Jon Arryn and Eddard Stark would surely lose their minds when they found out. Everything had started at the Driftmark meeting. The Three Kings had reached a formal agreement with the Golden Company commander, Harry Strickland. After the agreement, Stannis had met personally with Strickland and his two deputy commanders, discussing the course of the war and refining the plan to perfection. However, after the meeting, instead of returning directly to Teosh, the Golden Company commanders took a slight detour and paid a visit to Storm's End. There, they held a private meeting with King Robert Baratheon. As soon as the meeting ended, Stannis was urgently summoned to the king's side. Come here, Brother Robert had said cheerfully. I have fantastic news for you. I'm sending an additional 10,000 men for the Stepstones campaign. That's unnecessary, Robert Stannis had replied, maintaining his stoic expression. We already have a perfected plan. An extra 10,000 men won't make much of a difference. Then Stannis had heard Robert's perfect plan, negotiated with the Golden Company commanders, and honestly, it wasn't such a bad idea. If it succeeded, the Stepstones problem would be resolved for a long time, and the coffers of the Three Kingdoms Alliance would be filled with gold. If it failed, it would be a massive waste of resources, and they would become a laughingstock. Still, Robert was willing to take that gamble, so Stannis approved. After all, as a Stormlander, he had to obey his king. I'm a complete fool for following Robert's mind, Stannis cursed himself. Then again, even he couldn't have predicted things would turn out this way. At first, the original war plans of the Three Kings had gone so flawlessly that even Stannis was surprised. Bloodstone had been conquered with minimal trouble, and the other islands quickly fell after coordinated and swift attacks. Not even the Targaryens with their dragons had achieved such an effortless victory in the Stepstones. In Stannis' view, the discipline of the army, the quick exploitation of the shock from betrayal, and sheer luck had played a significant role in this victory. Once the original plan was largely completed, it was time for Robert's plan. The first major problem arose when they set sail to execute it. The Teosh fleet appeared before them. Their 40,000 strong army could easily crush this fleet, but doing so would take time, and wasting time would cost them their element of surprise and doom the plan to failure. So Stannis made a decision. He would deal with the Teosh fleet while the remaining soldiers continued the plan. It was undoubtedly a risky move because the Teosh fleet wasn't that much smaller than the Three Kings Alliance fleet. Stannis took only the 5,000 strong Vale army led by Jon Royce with him. Bringing too many soldiers would unnecessarily burden the fleet. He entrusted the remaining 32,000 soldiers to Roose Bolton, the commander of the Northern Army. Stannis respected the man as an effective and pragmatic leader in war. He was confident Roose would execute the plan flawlessly. The battle with the Teosh fleet had been incredibly difficult, but in the end, the Alliance army managed to encircle and defeat them. Still, it was a Pyrrhic victory. They had lost far too many ships and soldiers, and Stannis had been wounded during the battle. He had been bedridden for the next 3 days. If he had learned what kind of progress Robert's plan had made in his absence, he would have dragged himself out of bed and intervened immediately. Robert's plan was, in truth, far more the Golden Company commander's plan. Robert had merely been convinced and agreed to sponsor it. In fact, the event that had truly encouraged this plan was the Greedoom disaster. After the catastrophe, an anti-Valyrian sentiment began to take shape in Westeros, and this particularly drew the ire of the proud Valyrian city of Lies, whose nobles prided themselves on preserving their pure Valyrian bloodline for generations. Soon after, these nobles felt the need to respond, and at the time, the only Westerosi institution within their reach was the Golden Company. No assassination attempt occurred, but the commanders and their army were humiliated and disgraced in every way possible. Before long, a hatred toward Lies began to fester within the Golden Company's ranks and leadership, one of the reasons they agreed to cooperate with the Three Kings Alliance. Robert's plan was actually quite simple. If the Stepstones could be conquered without much trouble and they had enough soldiers to spare, they would use their advantage of surprise and attack Lies. The people and nobles of Lies generally focused on trade, slavery, or prostitution, professions far removed from warfare. The city's defenses relied heavily on mercenaries. The Golden Company was itself a mercenary army and had long held the title of the undisputed number one in Essos. Consequently, they had some connections within the mercenary units guarding Lies. According to Lord Strickland, they could be convinced to open the gates. The conquest would only be temporary. The Alliance army couldn't hold Lies for long. Proud Valyrian cities like Volantis would never sit back and watch. The true objective of the campaign was to plunder the Lies Bank, second only to the Iron Bank of Bravos, and seize the gold within for the Three Kings Alliance. Once Lies had been humiliated and weakened this way, Teosh and Myr, the other members of the Triarchy, would see an opportunity for themselves. Instead of setting their eyes on the rocky stepstones, they would covet the grand treasures of Lies. In Stannis' absence, the Alliance army under Roose Bolton's command carried out the plan almost flawlessly. The city was struck with shock when a massive army suddenly appeared at its doorstep. The Lies nobility had made no preparations for a siege. Later, Golden Company commanders secretly infiltrated the city and offered the mercenary leaders guarding Lies a generous share of the loot. Just as planned, the city gates were opened. Had Stannis been there that day, he would have done what he came to do: plunder the Lies Bank, ensure the city was humiliated and weakened enough, and then withdraw. Had Yohn Royce been there, he would have acted with ample honor and prevented the other commanders from behaving otherwise. But that wasn't the case. Neither of them was there. Instead, Harry Strickland, deeply insulted by the nobles of Lies, was there. Courtnay Penrose, the commander of the Stormlander army and the Queen's brother, who held strong anti-Valyrian sentiments, was there. And that bastard Roose Bolton was there. Lies had not been conquered, no, the city had been truly pillaged and destroyed. While Stannis was fighting the Teosh fleet, the Alliance army had wreaked terror in the city for an entire week. They plundered not only the Lies Bank but also every house they came across. The majority of the Lies people, noble or common, were butchered like pigs, and women were raped repeatedly. Nearly 40,000 of the city's 200,000 population were brutally slaughtered, and the majority of the survivors fled. A significant portion of the women were captured and kept as bedfollowers for the return journey. When Stannis learned this, he lost his mind, truly went mad. He wanted to immediately kill Roose Bolton and the other two fools on the spot, but he had no authority to butcher the nobles like pigs. Only his brother, the king, could do that. For the first time in his life, Stannis wished he were king. He did everything he could to minimize the damage. His first act was to ensure that the Lysian prisoners and women were immediately taken from the soldiers and delivered to a safe place. Some soldiers objected to this decision, but before long, their heads adorned the ends of spears. The good news was the wealth they obtained. The spoils of the plunder were truly enormous. The treasury of the three kingdoms, members of the alliance, would grow several times over, and they would not face gold shortages for a long time. Also, the triarchy had been dismantled as planned, and they would not pose a threat to stepstones for a long time. The trade routes were secure, meaning the initial goals of the war had been largely achieved. The bad news was that Valyrian cities, especially Volantis, had begun to cry out for revenge. When news of the Lies sack and its details spread, anti-Westerosi ideologies in Essos reached a peak and would remain popular for a long time. Unlike the anti-Valyrian supporters in Westeros, the Essosi had little reason to hate Westerosi people. Yes, there was an anti-Westerosi sentiment beginning to form in Essos, but it was more of a childish, if they hate us, we should hate them back mentality. However, the news of the Lies sack gave the Essosi plenty of reasons to despise Westeros. The sack of Lies would certainly have serious consequences for Westeros. Stannis sighed deeply as he looked at the scene before him. Traitors, looters and rapists. Damn those Westerosi, cursed the Lies infantry commander. I'm sorry, Taro said Golden Company's deputy commander, John Mudd, raising his hands helplessly. As you know, our word is good as gold is our motto, but there are things in this world more valuable than gold. Things like home. Like homeland. Stannis thought to himself that what they did to Lies wasn't for the good of Westeros. They did it because all of them were sons of bitches. Enough. He raised his hand. Commander Taros, we will only release you under one condition. Take this letter and deliver it to the Volantis High Council. The letter was a desperate attempt to start peace negotiations, but it had to be done. Stannis did not have the authority to write such a letter, but he had taken the initiative. The commander in front of him said nothing and nodded, taking the letter. However, Stannis could see the deadly hatred in his eyes. Stannis had learned that the commander's daughter had been raped and killed during the sack of Lies. Stannis ordered the man to be released and sighed deeply. After the sack of Lies and the atrocities that took place, he was left alone with his anger and guilt. Notes. The sack of Lies will definitely have consequences, but no matter what, it won't be as great a tragedy as the Greedum, and thus it won't face the same massive backlash. In fact, aside from Braavos, almost every other city in Essos had likely been plundered this way several times before. Still, as I said, the sack of Lies serves as a milestone because it is truly where the seeds of mutual hatred and racism between the people of the two continents were sown. Chapter 13, Eddard III. Summary. Robert's Rebellion 283 AC. Maidenpool Council 284 AC. The Driftmark Meeting, 288 AC. Sack of Lies, 290 AC. This chapter, 291 AC. Chapter text. The North is strong enough on its own. Why don't you demand independence? Because the new empire of Gis is a beast we cannot defeat alone, because many Northerners are currently fighting for the Federation Army, because the food and resources we receive from the southern provinces are crucial for our people's welfare, because this is the continent unified by Eddard the Unifier, the last king in the north, and it will not be the Northerners who tear it apart. Asher Dornstark, High Governor of the Northern Province. Fuck. Ned cursed inwardly. The news was not good at all. Ned had been furious when he received news of the sack of Lies. In fact, if it had been up to him, he would have executed Roose Bolton, the main culprit behind this event. However, the hand of the king, Roderick Riswell, had immediately talked him out of it. The other northern lords did not care at all about what had happened to the people of Lies. To them, Roose Bolton had carried out an incredibly successful campaign that filled the coffers of the Northern Kingdom with gold. If Ned had punished the Lord of the Dreadfort in this situation, he would have undoubtedly faced the backlash of the Northern Lords. In their eyes, King Eddard Stark would have been punishing Roose Bolton out of jealousy, simply because he saw him as a rival. If they truly believed that, their loyalty and trust in the royal family would have been seriously shaken. Besides, on what grounds would Ned even punish Lord Bolton? Lies was already known for its slave trade and for abducting women to force them into prostitution. Even the High Septon of the Faith had not condemned the sack, on the contrary, he had fully approved of it. Robert was saddened by the way the sack had unfolded, but not by the act itself. In fact, ever since he had slain Roriga during the rebellion, his name had never reached such heights, and he was enjoying it. Jonarin was also angry, but all he could do was scold Robert. The people of Westeros would not long for the City of Lies. After the sack of Lies, relations between Westeros and the Valyrian cities had become incredibly tense. In fact, throughout history, Lies had suffered similar sackings before. Forget Lies, even beyond that, all the cities of Essos, except for Braavos, had at some point faced similar raids and massacres. Still, the sack of Lies had provoked an enormous reaction from the proud Valyrian nobility across Essos. That was because this sack was not about "we won the war, so